against opponents. But in subsequent decades, he successfully climbed the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, becoming Archbishop of Buenos Aires and Cardinal in 2001. He acquired a reputation for humility and lived modestly.
En nuestra ciudad, lo vemos todos los días. Hay gente que tiene sitio, que tiene cabida, y hay gente que sobra.
In 2013, with the shock resignation of Benedict XVI, came another surprise. White smoke rose to signal a new pontiff.
Habemus Papa.
But the man who walked out was unexpected. The first pope from outside Europe for 1,000 years, 76-year-old Bergoglio chose the name Francis after the saint of the poor.
Il dovere del conclave era di dare un vescovo a Roma. Sembra che i miei fratelli cardinali sono andati a prenderlo quasi alla fine del mondo, ma siamo qui.
The Catholic Church was at a crossroads, beset by sexual abuse scandals and outdated attitudes. Pope Francis had a mandate to transform its troubled image,
No puedo dejar de manifestar
expressing pain and shame at the irreparable damage caused to children. Over a decade, he inched away from traditional conservatives, giving priests power to forgive abortions and criticising the criminalisation of homosexuality. But in 2024, his use of a homophobic slur and warning against admitting gay men into seminaries shocked and baffled many. Pope Francis appealed to world leaders to act on climate change, saying mankind had no right to abuse God's creation. He broke down while praying for peace in Ukraine, denouncing President Putin and likening his war to Nazi death camps.
En vez de ensayar el arma del diálogo, de la comprensión, del negociado, vamos al arma de la prepotencia, de la guerra, es más a la mano.
In his Christmas message last year, Pope Francis called for peace negotiations after urging Ukraine to have the courage to raise the white flag. During his tenure, he met face-to-face with refugees and victims of disasters and conflict, and urged calm during the COVID pandemic. At 86, the pontiff farewelled his predecessor. In the years since, his own health started to fail. Pope Francis pushed for a more inclusive church. It's now up to his successors whether that legacy continues.
So just confirming there, news from the Vatican that Pope Francis has passed away. It was only in the last 24 hours that he was seen with worshippers wishing them a happy Easter in Vatican City, where he was at St. Peter's Square, addressing to thousands of worshippers there. He was 88 years old. He came out in a wheelchair just in the last day and waved from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica to crowds saying, "Dear brothers and sisters, happy Easter." Then the Easter address was delivered by the clergy members there for him. What happens next? There will be 9 days of mourning in which a mass is held every day to celebrate his life, and millions of mourners are expected to arrive in Rome to visit the Vatican to pay their respects. What happens now is that there is no family tree or line of succession when it comes to picking a new pope. The decision rests solely with the cardinals, and they will go through a process of a papal conclave to vote on who they want to take over. So that breaking news from the Vatican there, that Pope Francis has passed away just a day after appearing on the steps, or the balcony rather, of St. Peter's Basilica during Easter services there. We know that he had suffered serious illness in his pneumonia, double pneumonia, in the previous months prior to that. Now, Michelle Rimmer spoke to senior Vatican correspondent Elise Ann Allen about Pope Francis's legacy and his determination to lead a simple life, helping those less fortunate.
Pope Francis, if you knew nothing about the Catholic Church, I think
the first visual you have, is him carrying his little black bag out of, the Vatican when he gets on the bus out after the conclave, after his election, and he's riding the bus with all the other cardinals, and he goes to his hotel to pay his own bill, and that's who he was. He was a simple man who liked to be part of the people. He didn't like any special treatment, and obviously being Pope, that kind of came with the deal, it came with the gig. But he was somebody that was seen as a simple man who wanted to simplify the church, who wanted to take a step away from this image of power and privilege, of the church and particularly the hierarchy, the clerical, status as some exalted status in the church. He fought back a lot against what he called clericalism, this attitude that being a priest and being a member of the clergy means you're exalted in some way. He wanted the church to be humble, and he wanted the church's pastors to remember that they are servants of the people. At the heart of it, he was a pastor, who came from the villas of Buenos Aires and then, in some ways never left.
He's sort of been described as almost like this rock star pope, and especially when he was first elected, sort of this rock star pope and the cool new pope. Do you think that image has evolved?
Like any pope, there is some honeymoon phase. You have this honeymoon phase where you're getting to know the person, and, there was immediately this big popularity with this simple, humble pastor, this image that he put out of that. And, I think as time went on, of course, debates erupted, controversies, developed, people discovered they weren't in agreement with him on everything. And he did have a lot of strong critics. But I think especially amongst young people, he was always wildly popular, and he remained that, that rock star pope. He in his first international trip to Rio de Janeiro for World Youth Day in 2013, he told Argentinian youth to hacer lío, wreak havoc, go out into the streets and make a mess, And in many ways, that's what he did with his papacy. and he still was telling young people to do that till the very end, in his World Youth Day encounters and in his meetings with young people. He would tell them all the time, go out, don't be afraid, take chances, take risks. He had a really special way of connecting with people, and that helped preserve that status, I think, as a rock star pope, as somebody that people really felt they could be close to.
What would you say are the key takeaways from his time as pope? What has he sort of changed or done that will go down in history?
I think some of the biggest issues are obviously the issue of migration. That was something, his very first trip outside of Rome was to the Italian island of Lampedusa, which is a huge migrant destination port from mostly Northern Africa. And he really carried that out consistently, that message of welcoming, protection, inclusion, promotion, and integration of migrants. That's something that he carried with him as a message close to his heart and as an integral part of his travels and in his messages wherever he went, in Rome and beyond, throughout his papacy. And that's something I think that will be one of his biggest legacies, and obviously he put the boat of migrants, this bronze statue, inside of St. Peter's Square as a symbol of just how much of an issue that is for our times and how close it was to his heart. I think also the issue of climate change. Obviously, he wrote 2 major documents on this, and he was supposed to be the first pope to attend, the COP28 summit in Dubai in 2023, but of course had to pull out because of respiratory illness. But it's something that has always been a big, major talking point of his, and something that he advocated for consistently is the need to be more attentive to our lifestyle habits, and develop a more sustainable lifestyle. I think also the issue of women in the church is something he's prioritized a lot. He made a point to not just appoint a lot of women to positions, but he makes sure that, they're the right people for the job, too. It's not about meeting a quota, He was very serious about that and very serious about trying to find ways to include women, that didn't necessarily have to do with ordination, and that pleased some people. It angered others. They wanted, some people wanted to see really the priesthood open to women. That was a line that Francis was not willing to cross, but he did seek other ways to find meaningful and decision-making leadership roles for women. And that's something that I think he'll also be remembered for, in addition to just his blanket simplicity and poverty. And I think those on on a dime are some of the biggest things that people are going to remember about Pope Francis and his time, his many years as Pope.
And any lowlights? Anything do you think that he would wish he could do again or undo?
I think some of the biggest challenges and question marks that Pope Francis will face have to do also with Vatican finances. He made a lot of efforts to reform the Vatican's finances, but that's been, I think, a complicated task for popes before him. It was a complicated task for him, and it will be a complicated task going forward. But I think also he's going to face some major questions on the clerical sexual abuse crisis. I think he, in many ways, took that very seriously and tried his best to he issued new norms, and that are targeting, they enforce mandatory reporting. They outlined a reporting structure within the church itself. If there's an issue with the bishop, they target bishops who are negligent in abuse cases, who cover up. So it's not just the abuse, but the cover up. He did take it seriously, and I think he tried to go after abusers, and he defrocked people. So he did take it seriously. But there are several big cases in his papacy that I think he made mistakes on. And sometimes he realized that, and usually he reversed course when evidence was presented to him that he had mistaken and that he had erred. Initially in the Chilean clerical sexual abuse crisis in 2018, he sided with the bishops accused of clerical abuse, and then reversed course later when evidence, to the contrary, was presented to him. A fellow Argentine bishop whom he had been friends with, Gustavo Zanqueta, near the beginning, Zanqueta had been accused of misconduct, sexual misconduct with seminarians, and the Pope had sided with him and then got very quiet about things as the civil trial went forward, and eventually that bishop was jailed, and that was that, and then big questions remain, I think, about, the case, one of the most notorious cases of the Jesuit Father Marco Rupnik, who is accused of abusing over 40 adult women, most of whom were nuns who belonged to a congregation he helped to found. He was a fellow member of the Jesuit order, like Pope Francis, and as we came to find out, there had been a lot of missteps behind closed doors in this case before anything ever went public. And then once it did go public, there were still a lot of missteps, and the big question was, what did Francis know, when, how involved was he involved, and what decisions or what influence did he perhaps have, or what pressures were there, because they were both Jesuits. Those are questions that were never answered. And so those are questions I think that he's going to have to, that are going to be attached to him, and that will go down in history as things that maybe he made big mistakes on and could have done better.
And just finally, it seems that in some areas Pope Francis has taken the Catholic Church in either a new direction or a different direction. Do you think that his successor will continue along that path, or, whenever a new Pope comes, there's opportunity for change? What's the feeling here that, is the Church going in the direction it wants to continue, or is change good?
That is the million-dollar question. So what every conclave, when the cardinals go in there, into the Sistine Chapel and the doors are closed, the fundamental question they have to ask themselves, or do we want continuity or discontinuity? Do we like the direction that things are going in, or do we want change? When Pope Francis was elected, they wanted change. You had Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, who had represented fairly similar worldviews and moral approaches to a lot of big questions of our time. And, I think the decision was, things haven't been going so great in spite of, the big personalities that we've had. Let's try a different direction. And Francis is sort of a, a whirlwind for everybody, and I think people are still getting their heads around that, even at the end, people are still trying to understand what Francis did. And I think that there's going to be some unpacking still going forward. And so I think it's a big question for cardinals as they head into a conclave and try to ask themselves, what do we want? And a lot of the cardinals are fairly unknown to one another. So what do they want themselves, and what do they want as a collective body? That's a difficult question to answer right now, and I don't think the cardinals themselves have an idea. I think the fundamental agreement, and what I've understood from most of the cardinals I've talked to and been in touch with, they like what Francis is doing. They like his impetus, on evangelization. They really appreciated this spur towards a missionary church that goes out to the margins. That's something that's been very appreciated. His whole social agenda is something that was very appreciated. And I think there will be a certain level of continuity that we can expect. I don't think they want to change completely. But what exactly is going to happen, we have to see.
Welcome now to ABC TV viewers to this special coverage of the passing of Pope Francis. The Vatican has confirmed his passing in the last 20 minutes or so. A statement has been released at 9:45 a.m. on Easter Monday from Cardinal Kevin Farrell, Carmelengo of the Apostolic Chamber. He spoke these words at the Casa Santa Marta. Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 8:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of his father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and of his church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage and universal love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised. With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite merciful love of the one and triune God. So that was the official statement that has been released from the Vatican there. Joining me now is Noel Debeen, a religion specialist with the ABC's Radio Religion and Ethics unit. Very good evening to you, Noel. Thank you for your time.
I'm glad to be here, even though it's such a sad occasion. So
it was only the last day that we saw Pope Francis wishing people well at Easter celebrations at St. Peter's Square.
It was, and this is a surprise, of course, to all of us who've been watching this very closely, because he came out of hospital. It looked like the prognosis was possibly very good. Well, not great, but it was going to be okay. And he was appearing, and it seemed that things were on the mend, though, as it turns out, we yet again have been surprised by the death of a pope. Always hard to anticipate, even though he'd been sick.
What sort of reaction are you anticipating to this?
There'll be two reactions, two chief reactions. A lot of people are going to be very distressed. The loss of Holy Father is very distressing for Catholics, always is. But of course, he has presided over a church which is, how would I put it, somewhat polarised. And there are those within the church who really didn't want him to be Pope, and he was quite aware of them. You may remember a couple of years ago, he came out of hospital after another health crisis, and he looked at the reporters and he called out, "I'm still alive." Like, he joked about it. He knew that he had his opposition. So there will be two things going on generally. One, there will be great grief, but there will also be, from some sections of the church, much more focus on his successor.
Let's talk about that process for those not aware of what happens next. I believe it begins with 9 days of mourning.
Yeah, that's the official 9 days of mourning officially. The cardinals of the church will be called in. And of course, there is only one Australian cardinal at the moment. That's Mikola Bichok, who became a cardinal not so long ago, 44-year-old, and he's from the Ukrainian right, and he represents, Australia in this vote. And I think the last time I checked, there are about 138 cardinals who will vote in this. They will be trying to get there now. Everything will be underway to get them to Rome so that they can attend the funeral, and then the pre-conclave meetings. So literally what happens is there are meetings where all the cardinals come together, and that means the ones who are over the age, if they're over 80, they can't vote anymore. But those pre-meetings, these sort of general gatherings of the cardinals, are quite key in people trying to work out what's going to go on next and who the preferred candidate is going to be. And so those meetings are important. And this Pope has, I think, last time I checked again, he had appointed about 2/3 of the voting cardinals, but he also appointed quite a number of people who are over age, like the English Dominican Timothy Radcliffe, who were very much on side with his pontificate. So those people will also be part of the discussions that are about to happen about what happens next. They don't get into the lock-in, the process that eventually the conclave will begin, and those voting cardinals will go inside the Capella Sistina, the Sistine Chapel, and there is a strict process of voting that goes on.
This will also, I think, Noel, be the first conclave where non-European cardinals outnumber European cardinals. Just how significant is that?
Well, it's absolutely correct. And I don't know, it's potentially significant for two reasons. This Pope has quite deliberately internationalized the church. And as your previous commentator was saying, he went to the peripheries. He went to all sorts of places that have not had cardinals before, including in the Pacific and other places like that. Mongolia's got a cardinal. But these are all newish cardinals. So they haven't been around for the previous conclaves. They haven't seen a vote go down before, and they don't necessarily know all the candidates. So there will be some jockeying, everybody reports this who's a specialist in the area, of trying to get to know who's got what priorities and what it is that the church needs. So those early meetings before the conclave begin, quite key for that. Some of those new cardinals are not necessarily going to be excellent in Italian, which can make, put them at a bit of a disadvantage in the meetings. But that's how it goes as a discussion. And it is said that it's not political, that it's the Holy Spirit. But I think it's fair to say that human beings will engage in discussions concerning the future of the church in a way that outsiders like us would say, that sounds a bit political. They'll be saying, what do we need? What are the greatest challenges to the church? What priorities do we have now?
Now, Noel, we're looking at live pictures in from Vatican City where there are people you can see they're gathering. What is that going to look like over the next few hours?
Look, the next few hours will be organisation for the funeral, and it will be the beginnings. So literally what would have had to happen is the Dean of the College of Cardinals of the Carmelengo, they attend the body, they tap him on the forehead and they call out his name, Jorge, 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 3 times to be sure that he's dead. And then they take his ring, the seal on the fisherman's ring that he has on there, and they smash it. That ring would have been used, of course, to imprint documents in ancient times. So there's a symbolism that the papacy is over when the ring is cut. And it will be, of course, melted and recast for the next one. But that's what happens. So now the preparations for the funeral begin, and people begin gathering. And, of course, the preparations for the conclave will begin. I have no idea whether the Vatican had any forewarning of this. I have no idea. I haven't heard. And we're all being quite surprised in the last hour to hear this news. So I don't know how advanced preparations are for those meetings, but I'm pretty sure they'll be in place because they have, 100 and something cardinals about to arrive. They've got to put them all up and they've got to get it all ready and have a funeral ready.
So much going on behind the scenes with so much tradition also involved here. A lot of people are going to be discussing over the ensuing hours, days, weeks, months about the legacy of Pope Francis. Many saw him as a socially progressive pope.
He was in some ways, as your previous commentator was saying, he did strengthen the place of women in the church in that he appointed heads of the dicasteries, which are like the ministries of the Vatican. He put women in charge. He insisted on women being given executive authority. He wouldn't ordain them deacons, though. So the ordination thing was there's a meeting going on. There's still a study going on whether a woman could be ordained a deacon or not, but he never went that far. And then when you talk about, another progressive way he might appear is with LGBTQI, Catholics and others. He's the one who's famous for saying, if somebody's living a good life and they're trying to know God, who am I to judge what their lifestyle is? He's that person, but he also did not change the laws of the Catholic Church. He changed the tone of the Catholic Church in terms of LGBTQI people and said we have to work to make people who feel inclusive. They have to be included, but he didn't change the law. And then Vatican finances, which were mentioned, by the way, it's my insider information is that the one thing he was focused on, the reason he didn't want to retire, the reason he didn't want to die, was the completion of the Vatican finances. That was the thing. And that was, of course, Cardinal Pell was the Cardinal Secretary for the Economy. He began that off. and he did major work in it. And then, of course, events overtook it. But that work is not complete yet. And it's quite key work that this Pope was very interested in, and he really wanted it. And his people inside the Vatican say this was what his drive was, to complete that review of finances and to make sure that the Vatican and the Vatican Bank and everything else was in order.
Now, Noel, I'll get you to stay with us, but I've been scanning, the headlines for international reaction, of which is coming through, and we have a statement from the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, right now, and it reads, "On behalf of the coalition, I express my condolences to Australians of Catholic and Christian faith upon the sad news of the death of the 266th Pontiff. His Holiness Pope Francis served God with the utmost devotion throughout his life. He was the first Pope from the Jesuit order and the first Latin American Pope. He lived frugally and simply. Above all else, he was driven by Christ's values of mercy and forgiveness. He emphasised those values in his last Christmas address, saying God's mercy can do all things. It unties every knot. It tears down every wall of division. God's mercy dispels hatred and the spirit of revenge. With God, may Pope Francis rest in peace." Those comments there by opposition leader Peter Dutton. Noel Debien is with us as well, speaking about the passing of Pope Francis there. Noel, I expect that we will be hearing a lot more outpouring of emotions and statements from leaders and people around the world.
I'm sure we will be, and this is, of course, the time. I'm a little bit reticent to do analysis on the Pope when this is the day of his death, but of course it's inevitable in our world that people are going to say, what's the significance of this and what's coming next? And it will be a matter of whether or not the cardinals vote for continuity of this type of reform, or whether they decide they need to look to another way forward to consolidate things. But as I say, the majority of those cardinals have been appointed by this Pope, and that can be interesting. It's an interesting thought to know that he has done that.
Now, his relationship with the Asia Pacific, if we look at the trips that he never made it to Australia, but he did complete a 12-day Asia Pacific tour in 2024, which was the longest trip of his papacy.
Well, yes, and you see, this is part of him when you're talking about him being inclusive and progressive. He kept saying, "I want to go to the peripheries. I want to go to the edges of the church." And Australia, America, we're not the peripheries. We're developed nations where the church is reasonably well established, even though it's facing its own problems. He emphasised, "No, I want to go to Papua New Guinea. I want to go to the smaller groups. I want to go to Indonesia." Mind you, the Indonesian Catholic Church is bigger than that in Australia, but it's tiny in comparison to the rest of the place. And he, of course, focused on the refugee. This is one of his very big things, is that displaced people need to be taken care of. And as you know, even over the weekend, when Vice President Vance came into Rome, there were reports that he hadn't met him, but the reliable reports I heard was the Pope did meet him privately, even though he was quite ill. But then he got Cardinal Parolin to come and give an exchange of views with Vice President Vance on the status of those who are immigrants and illegal immigrants, etc., within the United States. But that's consistent with what he does, or what he did. And the peripheries is the thing. And that relationship, of course, he has appointed cardinals to some of these areas. And that's part of what he's done too, that the Pacific Islands will have a say in the next Pope this time.
East Timor, I believe, also was one of the destinations that he visited in that tour.
Timor has had a special place because of course, it's a very Catholic section of when it was part of Indonesia. The Indonesian occupation there actually caused something quite strange to happen. When Indonesia arrived, only about 40% of the people would have said, we're Catholic in East Timor. But by the time they left, it was well over 80%. And that's partly because Pancasila and Indonesian policy said you have to say, what's your religion? You've got to be one of the five. Muslim, are you Hindu, are you Christian, are you Catholic, are you Protestant, what are you? And it's registered. And when the registering was required in East Timor, of course, most people registered as Catholic, and the church actually grew, and it became quite key to the struggle for independence within East Timor. And the church was really one of the most significant organisations within the nation, even though there had been some trouble with its bishops too. Bishop Bello came under suspicion at one point there and has really gone into retirement. But he was a hero of that period of time. And the Pope takes interest in these places, which are less, I suppose, wealthy, less organised. They're the peripheries that he's always talked about.
It's interesting you speak of Catholicism in those periphery areas. In Australia, I believe 20% of Australians are Catholic, but according to the 2021 census, Catholicism decreased to 20% from 22.6% in 2016. What do you put that trend to?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I've got to tell you, I could make a fortune all over the world. But what I will say is that this Pope has emphasised relationship. Really has. He's tried to emphasise, you know, when he talks about LGBTQI people, or he talks about trans people, or, you know, people who are gender fluid, who he meets. You know, he's actually made an effort to do that. Or he goes to Lampedusa. He's saying, reach out. It's not in the, or he was saying, reach out. It's not in the established places that you will find the vitality of the church. You'll find it in the growing places. And that's why he's doing that. And what's happening in Australia with the decrease of that religiosity is the same in America. It's the same in the United Kingdom. It's the same in France. It's the same in Germany. The developed world is seeing a disengagement from religion. And there are lots of reasons for that. And it's not only about, you know, the sexual abuse crisis, which has hit so hard, but it is about other factors where younger people are not identifying with the church and feel like it's not for them. And that's the case in Australia. You talk to any Australian parents of kids who've grown up, and you'll find a lot of them saying, no, my kids have detached. And that is a situation here. It's not only Catholicism, it's all religion for the most part. Mind you, Islam is growing, Hinduism is growing, Buddhism is growing, but off small bases. It's the large ones in Christianity as a general rule, like Catholicism, Anglicanism, Uniting Church. Those ones have been losing people, and it's about people not identifying with the church and not feeling that it had something for them, or they didn't recognise why they should be part of it. And this Pope was on about that. He was talking about it, and his periphery stuff is partly about that the church is about the way it is lived, not about what you talk or say or show. He wasn't one for great ritual, if you know, I mean, you know that he wasn't. There's the old rumour that, well, I don't know whether it's true or not, but apparently when he was elected, the assistants came up and they went to hand him a velvet cape which goes over the shoulders, which the last Pope liked. Pope Benedict liked it. And this Pope who's just died apparently said, no, Father, the carnival is over. And he meant, I'm not doing the display anymore. I don't know how true that is, but that is a widely spread rumour.
Just how, when you look at those actions or those stories, whether or not they were correct to the word, but how different was he to his predecessors?
Oh, it depends on what you're talking about. For a lot of Catholics inside the church, in terms of liturgy, which is the way they pray, he was, how would I put it, simpler. He wanted simplicity, whereas the immediate previous Pope was from Bavaria, and he really did like ritual, and he really did promote music, and he loved the vestments, he loved all that sort of stuff. Francis was not like that. Francis was quite simple and wore quite a simple pectoral cross, the one that goes over his chest, over his heart. He was simple, and he preferred, when he was appointing others, to appoint those who understood simplicity, that the key of Christianity is about that. So those who don't like him, they found that quite hard that he was like that. But so the ritualists were not keen on him. In terms of sex abuse, as has been reported, he has a record which is in between, in that the previous Pope Benedict was quite strong in it. It's not often reported how strong he was, but the previous Pope got rid of over 100 bishops, and half of those were to do with the mishandling of sexual abuse issues. This Pope did continue that, but as mentioned before, in Chile and other places like that, he seemed to not get it first. Like at first he was like, no, I can't believe that's happening. And there are those who will say of him that his background is as a South American male culture, and that may be partly why he saw things the way he saw things. I can't really answer on that, but I've seen very solid authors and researchers talk about this, that the culture of the person can affect how they might approach that issue. But then again, he's strengthened the presence of women in governance. And that, as you know, from our Royal Commission here in Australia, was one of the things they put forward as part of the solution to the organised churches and their problems, that the lack of women in governance meant there were no women's eyes on the issues of children and the safety of children. And this Pope has been doing that. So, again, a mixed bag.
If we can go back to what we touched on earlier, Noel, about the process now, and a lot would be going on behind and in front of the scenes. We know that the conclave must start between 15 and 20 days after the seat is vacated, and the Pope is chosen. The new Pope will be chosen by around 120 cardinal electors who, as you mentioned, have to be under the age of 80. Tell us a little bit about those that had been firming up in recent months and over the past year as who might be in contention for the role.
Oh, again, another $1 million question. And there will be 138 or so. At last count, it's more than 120. He's actually expanded the group. And there are people who have been mentioned, which are talked about in the press. And I don't know whether that stuff is going to come through or not. One is in the Philippines, and he's seen as the Filipino version of Pope Francis, and he will possibly be a contender, possibly. But, you know, I'm very hesitant to do those things. I've only ever heard it once, you know, predicted correctly. In the last conclave, I remember Richard Leonard, a Jesuit, who was working with the ABC, with Geraldine Doog at the time, mentioning on the ABC that, you know, we should all be looking at Jorge Bergoglio. Only time in all the time I've worked within this area that I heard somebody actually get it right. So I don't want to put myself yet in that position.
No, of course, I understand entirely. Look, really good of you to join us to get your insight on Pope Francis and this very, as you said, sad day for Catholics who will be mourning his loss. Noel Debien, religion specialist with ABC's Radio Religion and Ethics Unit. Thank you.
Thank you.
And do stay with us. We will have continued coverage of the passing of Pope Francis throughout the evening here on ABC TV and the News Channel. Well, Pope Francis walked out to greet thousands of Catholic faithful on the day he was elected by the conclave in March 2013. He broke with tradition by asking the gathering to pray for him instead of first blessing the crowd. Let's listen to part of his first ever address from the Vatican balcony.
Brothers and sisters, good evening. You all know that the duty of the conclave was to give a bishop to Rome. It seems that my brother cardinals have come almost to the ends of the earth to get him, but here we are. Let us say this prayer, your prayer for me, in silence.
Well, Pope Francis was appointed as the leader of the Catholic Church by the conclave in what was considered to be a surprise choice in March 2013. He was, as we've been reporting, the first non-European pontiff to be elected in nearly 1,300 years. Let's take a look back at how the ABC covered the news 12 years ago on the day the Pope was appointed.
Ushering in a new era. Francesco! Pope Francis is unveiled to the Catholic world. Euphoria in his homeland, Argentina celebrates the Prince of the Church who lived amongst his people. Good evening, Ian Henderson with ABC News. The Catholic Church has a new leader tonight, the first to come from outside Europe in more than 1,000 years.
It's been a momentous day in Rome. Thousands of people poured into St. Peter's Square as white smoke billowed from the Vatican chimney.
76-year-old Argentinian Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio was the surprise winner.
Pope Francis becomes the Church's 266th pontiff and the first from South America. He is a moral conservative, but as a Jesuit, he's known as a passionate advocate for social justice and welfare. And Francis will lead the world's 1.2 billion Catholics from the Vatican.
They came in their tens of thousands, braving the cold and rain. But most were not expecting what happened next. The white smoke meant just one thing. And everyone wanted to be as close as possible to greet the new pontiff.
This is the moment they've all been waiting for. Absolute joy. The rain, the cold, it doesn't matter. Tremendous excitement. They have a pope. They have a new beginning for the Catholic Church.
After waiting more than an hour, finally the announcement, we have a pope.
Habemus Papam.
As people were told his name, the Argentinian nuns could not contain their joy. The man who began his day a cardinal ended it one of the most powerful people on the globe, here on that balcony to address a packed St. Peter's Square and a waiting world.
The
work of the conclave is to give a bishop to Rome. It seems my brother cardinals went to find him almost from the end of the earth. But here we are.
His first audience as Pope loved what they heard, many overjoyed with their new leader.
Go, Francesco! Francesco! Francesco!
I didn't expect this. It's unbelievable, but I am so happy.
This was my feeling is coming from Latin America because this is a first sign. We are big and we need to have sometime a big papa. We have it.
It's not only Italians and Europeans, it's now one from South America. Why not?
Pope Francis I has broken Europe's long hold on the papacy. It's unclear how that will change the Church. But as tens of thousands of the faithful streamed out of St. Peter's Square, there was a strong sense this was a beginning like no other. Philip Williams, ABC News at the Vatican.
Well, Pope Francis came into the papacy in early 2013 as the former Archbishop of Buenos Aires. He became the first Pope from the Americas. Here's a bit of what Catholics around the world had to say at the time.
I think it's a blessing for all of us because he was very humble. First of all, he asked to all of us to pray for him. And this is something incredible.
It's a very simple person. Usually when we are in Buenos Aires, one of the biggest cities, Cardinal, Archbishop, we expect a lot of protocol, but it was very simple. He came to open you the door, to prepare for you a coffee, like everyone. Very simple person, but also very serious.
I think because of his experience, because he's different, because he brings something different, because he's from this part of the world, yeah, a moment of expectation, a moment of hope, an anticipation as well. I mean, people are going to wait. The fact that he's a Jesuit, the first Jesuit Pope, people are saying, well, what does that mean? What is that going to do to the papacy that now suddenly there's a Jesuit?
Holy Francesco was a very good man, so I hope he will be so good, so open for all the world like Francesco.
Well, Colm Flynn is the Vatican correspondent for EWT News, a global Catholic TV and radio news network, and he joins me now from Rome. Good evening, Colm.
A very good evening to you and good morning here from the Eternal City.
News of the Pope's passing has only been made in the last hour or so. What sort of reaction are you seeing where you are in Rome?
A shocked reaction here, not just in Rome, but around the world, Kat, because you have to remember we are just after coming out of Holy Week. Easter Sunday was yesterday, where although the Pope didn't celebrate the main Easter Sunday Mass, at the end of it, when the crowd of 35,000 people started saying, Viva el Papa, Viva el Papa, he made an appearance at the balcony of St. Peter's Square. You could see that he was weak. He was looking more vulnerable than usual, of course, after that 5-week stay in hospital. But he said 2 sentences, Kat. He said to the crowd, crowd, "Good morning, my brothers and sisters, and I wish you a happy Easter." So the surprise this morning when the Vatican officially announced the Holy See that the Holy Father, Pope Francis, had passed away at 7:35 a.m. local Rome time inside the Vatican at the age of 88.
And as you touched on there, huge shock for many Catholics around the world, given he did appear on that balcony just 24 hours prior.
Yeah, and you're looking at that live shot there of St. Peter's Square, that and the beautiful basilica there in the centre of the shot. That is where he appeared less than 24 hours ago. And while, like I said, he was feeble and he was weak, the crowd were ecstatic to see the Holy Father because it wasn't known how much we would see of Pope Francis throughout Holy Week. Normally the Pope is the main celebrant over all of the main liturgical events. So an Easter week in Rome without the Pope was a little bit of a strange one. So the relief and the reassurance to see the Holy Father yesterday was quite something for all the faithful and the tourists that are here in Rome at the moment. And he was still working somewhat, because you have to remember, Kat, that during that Easter Mass, he was meeting with the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, just a couple of meters away in his private residence, Casa Santa Marta, within the walls of Vatican City. Now, the two have sparred in the past, the Trump administration and the Holy See and Pope Francis, but this was a short and sweet, a cordial meeting, as the Vatican like to describe it. J.D. Vance went in and he said to the Pope, "It's good to see you. I know that you haven't been feeling well, but it's nice to see you doing better." The Pope didn't say much in response, but he smiled. He gave him a blessing, and then he gave the Vice President a number of gifts. He gave him 3 Easter eggs for his children. He also gave him a Vatican tie, and then a number of sets of blessed rosary beads. And also these shots, I have to say, from yesterday of Pope Francis going through the crowd of the Pope Mobile, because after he was on the balcony, Kat, he surprised everyone even more when he got up onto the Pope Mobile and he made his way through the crowds of people in St. Peter's Square. And that was something that surprised everyone. So all of this, to get the news this morning that the Pope has passed, is a complete and utter shock.
World leaders are making their tributes. We are standing by for the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese to speak at 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Time. We will bring that to our viewers as soon as he does step up. But some of the heartwarming tributes that are coming in, the Dutch Prime Minister saying Pope Francis was in every way a man of the people. The European Parliament President says his contagious smile captured millions of people's hearts across the globe. What else are you hearing?
Yeah, and Kat, you know, this idea of the papacy and capturing the hearts, I have been lucky enough to travel with the Holy Father, with Pope Francis, to countries right around the world. When I first took this job as a Vatican correspondent, one of my first trips was to the nation of Iraq with Pope Francis. No Pope had ever gone to Iraq before because it was deemed too unsafe. Pope John Paul II had tried to go in the late 90s, but the threat from militant groups there was just too great. Pope Francis was advised on a number of occasions not to make the trip to to Iraq because of ISIS, but he pressed ahead, and that was a powerful trip. After that, I travelled with him to places like Mongolia, to South Sudan in Africa, to Papua New Guinea last year. Remember, last year, even at an advanced stage, even with that underlying health condition, even though he had to use a wheelchair most of the time, he still travelled to places like Papua New Guinea, to East Timor, to Singapore, to Indonesia. These were incredible trips, not just for the politics of everything and geopolitically and the impact that the papacy can have visiting other nation states, but you see the humanity of Pope Francis, the spirituality at work, him connecting with the most vulnerable and the marginalised. And since he became Pope in 2013, that's what his focus was. His first trip was not to a grand cathedral or to a wealthy country. The first trip when he became Pope in 2013 was to the island of Lampedusa off the coast of Italy, where migrants were washing up after trying to make the perilous journey from northern Africa. And that set the tone for his entire papacy. He wanted to go to where people were on the margins, to where he thought people were suffering and they were forgotten. He was an advocate for the environment. He was an advocate for including more people into the papacy and the Catholic Church that perhaps had felt excluded before, different groups, different minorities. And I think that will be one of the hallmarks of his legacy.
Colm, you mentioned there that you travelled extensively with him covering his papacy. Many people really only got to know him, particularly Catholics, through television screens or digital ways, or reading about him, never really got an audience at all with him or was able to travel to see him. How would you compare the Pope Francis that you might have gotten to know behind the scenes through all the travels and work that you had with him to those that we really learnt of him through the screens?
Well, I think like many figures in the media, they can sometimes be politicised, they can be misinterpreted. I think at the heart of it, Pope Francis was someone who exuded simplicity, and I don't mean that in some kind of degrading way, but beauty and simplicity. I think it was St. Francis of Assisi who said, you should spread the gospel and, if necessary, sometimes use words. Pope Francis was a man all about the actions. For example, one of his first Easters here in Rome, he surprised everyone by washing the feet of not only prisoners, but of women as well. This was the Pope, the successor of St. Peter, getting down on his knees and washing prisoners' feet. Gestures like this were huge around the world and really spoke to people regardless of language, even regardless of religious affiliation, because he is someone who connected with the Muslim community, with the Jewish community, with people of no faith as well. I would often meet people who say, look, I'm not a practicing Catholic, I'm not religion, but I really love Pope Francis because of the simple way he was able to transmit his message of peace and of hope. Even yesterday, although he could only speak, Kat, for 2 sentences, he could only say 2 sentences really, he sat on the balcony, as you can see there, and he handed his pre-prepared script, his Urbi et Orbi, Latin meaning his message to Rome and to the world. He handed that to the Master of Ceremonies. It was a 20-minute script that the Pope had written, and in it, he called for the protection of life from the unborn child in the mother's womb to the elderly, to the sick, to the people on the margins. He said that he had a closeness to the suffering people of Palestine and the people of Israel. He said that he was hoping for a permanent ceasefire in Ukraine. He said he was praying for the people who were afflicted by war and conflict in parts of Africa, Lebanon, Syria, all over the world. This was just yesterday. You have to remember his 20-minute speech was read out while he sat beside the person, sometimes with his eyes closed. This, from the very beginning, was the message he wanted to give to the world. Peace, love, the message of the gospel.
He was really, you touched on so many of what I'm sure will be his legacies over the years, but he was a pope of many firsts when you look at where he came from and some of the things that he actually did.
I was in Argentina, would you believe, just 2 weeks ago. I was in his home city of Buenos Aires making a documentary about the legacy of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, his name before taking Pope Francis. He was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, the capital there. And I heard warm and beautiful things from all of the people that I spoke to about his legacy, about his life. And you know what? A legacy is in the eye of the beholder. It can be a mixed thing. Obviously, there will be people much smarter than I, biblical scholars and papal historians who will debate this for years and years to come. But even the people back in the slums of his city, the slums of Buenos Aires where he grew up, the beautiful things that they had to say about their memories of him coming to visit them when he was the powerful Archbishop in Argentina, coming to visit them in the slums. They were really beautiful things.
And there'll be
I'm sorry, you can hear the phone ringing here, Kat. Apologies for that,
no.
just because this is the biggest news story in the world at the moment. And as you can imagine, there are people calling from all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can just stay with us for another minute or two, if you've got that time there, Colm. A lot would be going on behind the scenes, like right now. We know that there's a lot of tradition wrapped up in what happens next with finding a new pope. I believe 9 days of mourning commences now with a mass held every day to celebrate Pope Francis, the Pope's life.
Yeah, the Vatican machine, if you like, will kick into gear now because you will have a period of mourning for the Pope. You will have different services and prayer offerings in St. Peter's Square here right next to me in the Vatican. And then after that, of course, we'll be into a papal funeral, which is a state funeral because remember, it's the smallest nation state in the world. And then after that, of course, the reality is that the Vatican will continue on and they will look at a conclave on the horizon and we will be looking to the future of the Catholic Church.
Colm, if I can just interrupt you there because we need to farewell our viewers on ABC TV. you can continue watching this coverage on the ABC News channel. Apologies for interrupting you there. If you are just joining us now, we are covering the death of Pope Francis, which has been announced in the last hour or so. Flynn has been joining us from Vatican City. We will leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.
A very busy day indeed. If you are just joining us, the world's most senior Catholic, Pope Francis, has died at the age of 88. The Vatican announced the Pope's passing and said Francis had returned to the house of the Father. We've got correspondents on standby and analysts also waiting to check in, but we are waiting to go to the Prime Minister, who is expected to step up shortly with his response to the passing. We have heard from the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, earlier this evening. So as soon as the Prime Minister steps up, we will take you there. But let's now go to London, where Michelle Rimmer is standing by for us. Michelle, thank you very much for your time. What is the reaction there to the passing of Pope Francis?
So there have been thousands that have already started to gather outside St Peter's Basilica, where this is the home of the Catholic Church. It's not where Pope Francis has passed. However, it's where his body is expected to be put on display in the coming days for people to mourn in person in Rome and to visit his coffin. And this will be on public display. However, it won't be the level of grandeur that we've seen with previous pontiffs. This was very much a deliberate approach by Pope Francis to scale back some of the rituals around his own death and burial. So he'll be placed on display, but not on a grand stand like we've seen in previous pontiffs' burials and funerals. We've had messages come through from different European leaders, including from the Italian Prime Minister, from the French President, from the Spanish Prime Minister. So he really was a man of the people, and he was not just an Italian pontiff. He often would speak Spanish. He's from Argentina. He was a man of the people, and he was a man of the world, and we're seeing an outpouring of grief and reflection, and congratulations on his legacy from leaders all around the world today, as well as mourning from the Catholic Church, from members of the Catholic Church from every end of the globe.
Michelle, you have covered extensively the life and the history of the late Pope Francis, and I guess that's why this comes as quite a shock, given it was only Easter Sunday where the Pope was wishing worshippers, giving his final statements through an aide, but was on that balcony there.
Yeah, so it was only really in the last couple of weeks that Pope Francis was released from hospital. He spent a month there being treated for double pneumonia, and there were concerns for his life at the time. But that had really almost completely disappeared as we saw him increasingly participate in public events. On Good Friday, he visited one of Rome's most crowded prisons, and he met with and blessed prisoners there. Then on Easter Sunday, he greeted people outside St Peter's Basilica. He was back in what's been affectionately coined the Pope Mobile, and he was, meeting babies, and he appeared to be not only in good spirits, but there were no obvious signs of the declining health that we had been reporting on and hearing about in months prior. And so this has really come as a shock this morning. The news was released in a statement from the Vatican at what was around 9 a.m. local time, and that was to say that at around 7:35 a.m. local time, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father.
Michelle Rimmer, thank you. We'll need to take you to Canberra now, where the Prime Minister is speaking. Anthony Albanese.
Australian Catholics and faithful around the world give thanks for the life of their Holy Father, Pope Francis, Bishop of Rome. Today, the prayers of more than 1 billion people from all nations and every walk of life go with Pope Francis to his rest. Born in Argentina in 1936 and ordained a priest in 1969, Pope Francis' fellow cardinals elected him Pope in 2013. His was a papacy of firsts, the first Pope to hail from the Americas, the first Jesuit Pope, and the first to take the name of that great champion of the poor, St. Francis of Assisi. Pope Francis' compassion embraced all humanity, and today he will be mourned by Catholics and non-Catholics alike. He urged us to remember all we hold in common, and he asked the world to hear the cry of the earth, our common home. He invited world leaders to join him and, to quote him, emerge from the dark night of wars and environmental devastation in order to turn our common future into the dawn of a new and radiant day. He was very much a modernist. His message that he sent out echoed in our region during his historic visit to Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Singapore and Timor-Leste. The first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere was close to the people of Australia. For Australian Catholics, he was a devoted champion and loving father. Pope Francis lived out his faith and vocation in word and deed. He was truly inspirational. In his modest way of life and at his weekly audiences, he demonstrated his commitment to peace, equality and inclusion. Pope Francis's love for humanity was powerful and profound. The memory and example of his compassion will long endure. As we mourn his death, we celebrate the gift of his life and presence among us, and we hold on to the resonant truth of Pope Francis's final Easter homily. The light quietly shines forth, even though we are in darkness. The promise of new life and a world finally set free awaits us, and a new beginning, however impossible it might seem, can take us by surprise, for Christ has triumphed over death. May God welcome Pope Francis to eternal life. I have asked the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet that all flags from the Commonwealth Government of Australia will fly at half-mast tomorrow as a sign of respect. And my sincere condolences to everyone who, for tonight, it will be a very difficult evening. Thank you.
And that was the Prime Minister speaking there on the passing of Pope Francis. Thank you for your company for this special coverage on ABC News on the passing of Pope Francis. I'm Catherine Robinson.
And I'm Joe O'Brien. So a huge moment for Catholics around the world. There was all that optimism after the Pope was on his deathbed like 2 months ago. And then the Vatican was so optimistic about his strength that he was going to be able to carry through. And I think a lot of people thought he was through the worst of it and we would be likely to see him for quite some time yet.
Particularly after where we saw him within 24 hours ago on the balcony addressing Easter worshippers.
And that's the thing, he held on to Easter, and that's what a number of people are saying at the moment, is that he would have thought that that was so important to be there for Easter and spread that message of hope. And Andrew West is the host of the Religion and Ethics Report with Radio National, and he joins us now. Andrew West, welcome. So give us an insight into the depth of feeling among Catholics around the world at this moment.
I'm not a Catholic, but I can assure you now, the Catholic world will be overwhelmingly in mourning, but most particularly, Joe and Catherine, in the global south. This is where Francis really has been a pope for the global south. He was the first pope from the global south, from Argentina, even though he is of Italian background and very much a European in many ways. He's the first pope from the global south, and he made the global south his priority. If you look at his trips, groundbreaking trips to Africa, but also to the Middle East, he was in Iraq not so long ago, and Iraq still torn by civil strife. He made a trip to Southeast Asia, to PNG. He just announced the canonisation of PNG's first ever saint. The global South loved Francis. This was an area where, if Catholicism is growing at all, and it is growing, but it is growing in the global South, it is growing in places like Africa, like South Asia, perhaps in China. That's a very controversial area that we should talk about at some point. But he is a pope for the global South, so they will be particularly in mourning. In countries like the United States, the pope was a rather more divisive figure. There's no question about that. It doesn't in any way overshadow his enormous legacy, the enormous well of compassion that he brought. It doesn't overshadow any of that to say that in parts of the United States, possibly even in pockets of Australia, parts of Europe, he was a more divisive figure. So the response to this Pope's death will be mixed. I think it will be overwhelming sorrow, but there will be sections of the Catholic Church, and we need to acknowledge this, that will be seeking a reset for a more traditionalist pope. They are sections of the Catholic Church, Catherine, that see this as an existential fight.
We'll talk about the next steps in just a moment. We just heard from the Prime Minister there saying that Pope Francis was very much a modernist. Where did you mentioned that he had great appeal in certain parts of the world and it was questionable perhaps in others. Where did his appeal lie?
The very first thing that he did when he emerged on the balcony at St. Peter's Basilica after becoming the Pope was to simply greet the people in the vernacular. I think he said in Spanish, "Good day to you," or in Italian, "Good day to you." He then, after he came back off the balcony and he removed the very elaborate vestments that he was wearing, he reportedly said to one of the aides, "Take this, the circus is over." He then went and said something to the effect of, "We want a poor church for the poor." This was always to be his emphasis. So I think the Prime Minister is correct to emphasise the Pope's appeal on questions of social justice. Modernist, in what way? That is a debatable point. As my colleague Noel Debian in the earlier hour pointed out, I think very astutely, Pope Francis hasn't changed a jot of Catholic teaching. He's changed the emphasis of it, but he hasn't changed a jot of Catholic teaching, whether it's on gender or sexuality or even environment or social justice, but he's chosen to emphasise certain elements of Catholic doctrine over others. That, I think, is where the distinction has been made.
And he has sought to change the structure of decision-making. He's laid the groundwork for that. To what extent has that started to happen where more importance is placed on the laity rather than the hierarchy of the Catholic Church?
You're spot on, Joe. He started a process called the Synod on Synodality. Now, I have to prick myself with a needle to keep myself awake when I think of it, because at its face, it's quite a mundane process. However,
at its core,
it could be something quite radical. It is about giving more autonomy to Catholics in different parts of the world. Now, that may mean that Catholics who come from very conservative cultures are allowed to be very conservative Catholics, but it also might mean that Catholics from more liberal parts of the Catholic world are allowed to emphasise those elements of their faith. So he hasn't, however, undone the core powers, though, of the bishops. This is an important point to make. He's relinquished, in a rhetorical sense, a lot of power, but he hasn't actually changed core canon law. The Vatican still appoints the bishops, except, of course, in parts of China, where it's very controversial, where the Vatican consults with the Chinese government on that. So his democratisation, in inverted commas, of the Catholic Church is very qualified. He's trying to infuse it with a spirit of greater pluralism. There's no question of that, a spirit of greater pluralism. But when it comes to actually changing canon law, that's an altogether bigger task. And I think that's something that we're going to see more likely in the next Pope, or indeed we may actually see some reversion, depending on the nature of the next pope.
And to what extent is it likely that the next pope will be someone of a similar thinking to Francis because of the way he has appointed the cardinals?
Yeah, this is a very good point, and this is what has the traditionalist wing of the Catholic Church quite worried. They think that the Pope has basically stacked the College of Cardinals. I think that's altogether a too simple reading. It's a very understandable reading, but it's too simple a reading. If the next Pope comes from the Global South, you can expect the next Pope to accentuate the concerns of the Global South, and they will be less the social and cultural concerns. They will be more environmental. They will be more about the huge migration flows, remembering the huge migration flows from Africa into Asia. They will be about conflict resolution. This Pope has walked into the teeth of some of the worst conflicts. I mentioned his visit to Iraq a few minutes ago. Not so long ago, he was in Sudan. He was in South Sudan with the head of the Anglican Church and the head of the Presbyterian Church. He has met with interfaith leaders, including the Grand Imam of a very significant Islamic university in Cairo. He's met with one of the Ayatollahs in Iraq. So he considers himself, and the legacy that he has bequeathed, is one of a church that wants to be engaged in the concerns of the Global South. So I think that's the important thing to remember, Joe. Even if, Pope Francis has quote-unquote stacked the College of Cardinals, it may not reflect the worst fears of the traditionalists or the best hopes of the liberals. That's the important thing.
And it'll be interesting to see how that plays into the vote. Andrew, if you could stay with us for the time being, because we do have people around the world, and we'd like to take you back to the UK now. And if you are just joining us, the world's most senior Catholic, Pope Francis, has died at the age of 88. This announcement was made from the Vatican of the Pope's passing, and said Francis had returned to the house of the Father. Michelle Rimmer has been standing by in London. Michelle, I cut you off before. Apologies for that, but the Prime Minister was stepping up with his statements. We were in the middle of speaking about the global reaction.
Yeah, so we're hearing increasingly from a number of world leaders. We've just heard from our own Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, but we've heard from the French President, from the Italian Prime Minister, from the Spanish Prime Minister, and all of their messages have been one of celebration of the life of Pope Francis and the legacy that he'll be leaving behind as a man of the people, a man that brought much change to the Catholic Church. And there are also, from members of the Catholic Church globally, there's been an outpouring of grief and mourning. He was very popular in many, many parts of the world. And in Rome itself, at the Vatican, we're seeing crowds gathering around St. Peter's Basilica, where we're expecting Pope Francis's coffin to be put on public display in the coming days. This is a pontiff that really made a name for himself as being a man of the people, a man of the poor, and he changed protocol around his own death and his own funeral and burial. And so over the next 9 days, we're expecting there to be a period of mourning in Rome, and during that period where there may have been perhaps more grandeur, this will be quite a simple process. It'll be a simple coffin that Pope Francis will be placed in at St. Peter's Basilica, and people from all around the world will come to visit him. Thousands expected to file past and to say a final farewell before he's buried outside of the Vatican at Santa Maria Maggiore Basilica. So this is the first pontiff in 100 years that will be buried outside of the Vatican grottos, and that's because this was his favourite church. This was somewhere when he was in Rome where he could, on personal occasion, go and visit. And this is said to be a basilica that honoured the Virgin Mary. And so Pope Francis, as he did in life, as he did in his leadership of the Catholic Church, also in death, he's forging his own path and laying out a potential future that may be followed by the Catholic Church, if that is what the conclave just decides to elect when it comes to a new leader.
Time in Rome when the Pope was particularly ill a couple of months ago. Give us some insight into the depth of feeling amongst the people that you spoke to when you were there in Rome. Yeah, so I spent a number of weeks in Rome when
it was unknown as to the Pope's condition. We weren't receiving a lot of information as to how he was going. And there were a number of ups and downs. And during those days where we were hearing that he was having respiratory crises or that his condition had deteriorated, you could tell not just within, members of the public, but also within Vatican correspondents, people that had spent time with him, that had worked with him and written biographies. They were particularly touched and saddened by the prospect of his potential death. And so he was much loved, not just by members of the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church, but by people who covered his life and who really knew him. I spoke to the Pope's biographer, and he felt particularly, I think, close to the pontiff, and there was particular concern for his health. It wasn't just a historic moment that he was covering, but people really felt close to him. They said that he was a man who always had time for people. They didn't know where he had the time, and that when they were with him, they felt as though, that they were the only person in the room, the only person that mattered. And up until, the last day of his life, Pope Francis was out meeting with members of the public. There are photos from just 24 hours ago when he was holding babies, when he was greeting people from the Pope Mobile, as it was affectionately called. And so he really has his legacy as a man of the people, and he touched people. It was he has a legacy of being welcoming and of greeting. I think it was the very first trans person that visited the Vatican. He greeted them, people who were unwell, who had skin conditions. He was seen hugging them in a way that potentially previous pontiffs hadn't been quite so open to people from all walks of life. And so there's a real depth of love for him in Rome, in the Vatican, when I was there covering his hospital stay, but all around the world. He's really touched a lot of people's lives and will leave a very strong legacy.
Speaking in the last hour or so, we are seeing more people attending there at St. Peter's Square, where, as you mentioned, the Pope was only seen in the last 24 hours with that Easter address. Pope Francis's death now sets in motion a centuries-old process of electing a new Pope. Can you take our viewers through what we're likely to see over the next ensuing days?
Yes, so initially this is a period of mourning and reflection. So there'll be 9 days of national mourning, during which time the pontiff's body will be put on display at St. Peter's Basilica before he has a burial at, Santa Maria Maggiore Basilica, which is outside of the Vatican. It'll be a much simpler ceremonial process than what we've seen in previous years, but there will still be a number of sort of choreography that's been enshrined in the Catholic Church for hundreds of years. Beyond that, sort of within the next 20 days, there'll be all of the cardinals that are under the age of 80, so eligible cardinals, will begin gathering in Rome and eventually take part in what's known as the conclave, where they will need to elect a replacement for Pope Francis. Now, we don't know how long that could take. It could be a very short process. We've seen that in the past, or it could take a long time, and that's because there'll need to be a two-thirds majority to elect the replacement for Pope Francis. So we know that at least over the next month that there will be a funeral, a burial, and then this gathering of the conclave to elect a replacement.
And Michelle, you mentioned before that you'd interviewed the biographer to the Pope when you were there in Rome a couple of months ago. Give us an insight into what he had to say. Did he have any one-on-one contact with Pope Francis? And what did he have to say about his legacy?
Yeah, he did. So he actually worked with Pope Francis to write a book around the COVID pandemic. And one of the really key takeaways from that discussion that I had was people were referring to, and I myself was referring to Pope Francis as being this sort of modern Pope and, this sort of future forward-thinking Pope. And that was something that the biographer sort of, he wanted to make clear, was that this wasn't a pontiff that was breaking away from the church and its beliefs, but rather he was a man of the people, and he was someone who believed that regardless of someone's choice in life or their lifestyle choices, that he loved them, that God loved them. However, he was still a staunch believer in some of the principles that the Catholic Church followed. For example, he greeted, it was a trans woman outside the Vatican, and everyone was saying, great, he's, pro, different sort of gender fluidity. And then the next day, I think it was on a plane, he was saying that he was still a staunch believer in or he was discounting gender ideology, and so he was still a staunch believer in the values of the Catholic Church and some of the long-standing policies around that. But he was someone who, regardless of who you were, whether you were male, female, what it was, you had a place in the church. And he was someone who loved people, but he still loved and still stuck by a lot of the policies and traditions of the Catholic Church.
Joining us there from London with the latest reaction from that part of the world. We are joined by Andrew West, who is the host of Religion and Ethics Report on Radio National, who is joining us throughout this extended coverage of the passing of Pope Francis. I think a really interesting relationship to look at, Andrew, is the relationship that Pope Francis had with other world leaders, particularly the Trump administration.
Yeah, it's a very good question, Catherine. We need to remember Pope Francis is a geopolitical figure. Every pope, by virtue of being the head of a city-state, that is the Vatican, is a geopolitical figure. But this pope, I think perhaps more than others, took up the political fight. Now, he didn't name people necessarily in the political fight. Let's take, for example, the recent meeting that he had, only in the last 24 hours, I think, with J.D. Vance, the Vice President. It wasn't so long ago that the Pope was remonstrating with J.D. Vance, didn't name him, but made it very clear that he was repudiating J.D. Vance's take on a Christian doctrine about love for those in your closest circle, sort of radiating out and ever weakening. He was saying, no, that's not Christian doctrine. On the question of the Trump administration, again, the Pope never named, I think, Donald Trump, except to say that his policies, or policies without necessarily pointing to Trump, but it was obvious who he was talking about, were a disgrace when it came to immigration. Remember at the last election in the United States, he said, well, American Catholics have got a choice between the lesser of two evils. He never told them what the lesser of two evils was. He said the Democrats favour abortion without limits, the Republicans favour very punitive, cruel immigration policies. He was willing to name what he saw as deviations from Catholic social teaching. That raised the ire of the White House. There's just no, including, by the way, Joe Biden's White House as well. The Pope was not enamoured of Joe Biden because of positions on abortion, but his clashes with Trump and the Trump administration were quite pronounced, especially on questions of poverty, immigration, refugees. Remember, not long after he became the Pope, one of the first things he did was go to Lampedusa, an island just south of Sicily. He held a mass on an upturned boat that had brought refugees and asylum seekers to Lampedusa. He consecrated it as an altar and held a mass there. For all of the Trump administration's first term, the Pope made it very clear that he was opposed to mass deportations, that he was opposed to cuts to foreign aid. He was very clear about that. He also got offside with a lot of European leaders as well.
And so to what extent do you think his Jesuit background had to do with his passion for that subject?
Yeah. Well, of course, we have a popular image of the Jesuit shaped by a brilliant movie 40 years ago. I think the question of his Jesuit background was actually, Joe, I'm not sure that it was his Jesuit background. In a way, I think it was the background shaped by Argentina and the politics of Argentina. A year after he became Pope, I went to Buenos Aires, his hometown.
And the poverty in Argentina.
And it was the poverty in Argentina, but he also remembered a country that had been middle class. He also remembered a country with much narrower levels of wealth distribution. And he saw what happened in the 1990s, for example, under the Washington Consensus and economic neoliberalism. And he also saw how the Peronist Party, a tough political organisation, shaped that country. And I think that, more than his Jesuit background, I'm sure many will contest this, I'm totally open to that, but I think his background in Peronist Argentina, the politics of Argentina, shaped his worldview even more than his Jesuit background.
And you hesitate to call him a modernist, as did a previous guest.
Yeah.
But was his willingness to openly criticise political leaders maybe an indication of a more modern papacy?
It was an indication of a very brave, gutsy papacy. Let's remember Pope John Paul II was a very political figure as well. I mean, largely credited, correctly so, with helping to bring down the Berlin Wall. The interesting difference between the two men, though, is that it was an easier choice for someone like Pope John Paul II. He knew what side he wanted to put the church on because it was a very clear, sharp distinction between a kind of, communist, Stalinist worldview and the democratic West. And Pope John Paul II knew what side he wanted to place the church on, and he also placed the church on the winning side. For Francis, it's been a much tougher battle. He's had to choose, or he's tried to avoid choosing. He's had to negotiate much more difficult politics, whether it's the politics of the Middle East, whether it's the politics of Russia versus Ukraine, whether it's the disintegration of the political consensus in Europe. He's watched parts of Europe go towards a Trumpian kind of nationalism, while others try desperately to cling to a kind of post-war social democracy, the kind of thing that the Pope is probably quite comfortable with privately. His has been a much more complex political task.
But isn't care for refugees pretty black and white when it comes to the Catholic Church?
Yes, it is. It is. But remember, even the Pope had to say a few years ago, it's not unreasonable for countries to want to control their borders. Now, for him, it's all about the way that you do it. But even the Pope did say at one point, I understand why people are upset in Europe about open borders. Negotiating that kind of political difficulty was something I don't think any other Pope has negotiated since World War II.
Andrew West, thank you very much for coming in and joining us.
It's been my pleasure.
Leave it there, but really great to get your insight.
It's been my pleasure.
OK, well, we have reporters stationed across the country. Let's head to Sydney first and bring in reporter Fiona Willan, who is outside St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney. Fee, what's the local reaction been?
Well, Catherine, there's no official service planned here tonight, but we have seen a few people stopping by to quietly pay their respects. And in about 45 minutes, we'll be hearing from the Archbishop of Sydney. He's released a statement a short time ago saying the Church in Sydney and Australia joins with people throughout the world in mourning the passing of the Holy Father. As priest, bishop and pope, he embodied Christ's command to care for all people, especially the most vulnerable. The New South Wales Premier Chris Minns has also put out a statement. I'll read you a little bit of that one too. It says, to the end, Francis was a pope of the people. As an archbishop, he would catch the bus around Buenos Aires, and as pope, he said no to the official limousine. Pope Francis understood that grace lives within every human being, whether they were born rich or poor, high or low. Now, Pope Francis never visited Australia, but he does have many followers here. Around 5 million Australians are Catholic, so that's around 20% of the population roughly. So no doubt many people around the country will be pausing to think of him tonight.
Fee Willan reporting there from Sydney. And so if you're just joining us, within the last hour we've had this news through that Pope Francis has died. The Vatican made the announcement saying, dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and of his church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised.
With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite, merciful love of the one and triune God. That was the statement released from the Vatican in the last hour or so. Harvey Biggs is stationed for us at St Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne, and he joins us now. Good evening, Harvey.
Good evening, Catherine. Good evening, Joe.
What are you seeing there? Are people starting to come to where you are?
They are. In fact, the Prime Minister is here at the moment. He was brought in about 15 minutes ago and was guided into the cathedral by the Dean of the cathedral. He's here to pay his respects to Pope Francis, and in the last few minutes we have started to see more of Melbourne's Catholic community arrive here. We expect this to really be a focal point in the next few hours and days as the news ripples out that the Pontiff has passed away. Of course, I think many people started to have, this has come as a bit of a shock because, of course, the Pope has had his really severe health issues in the last 6 months or so, but there were signs of improvement. He did make that brief appearance over Easter at the Vatican. So I'm starting to see a few flowers at the gate here. There's a big press pack, obviously, before the Prime Minister. This is obviously during the campaign. He hasn't spoken to the media directly here, but he has put out a statement online. So it's a very quiet and sombre mood here as people start to gather at this church.
Harvey Biggs at St Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne. Thank you.
So recapping our breaking news tonight, Pope Francis, history's first Latin American pontiff, has died. He was 88. The Vatican announced the news in a video statement saying that his entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and of his church.
Cardinals will now be summoned to Rome to choose Francis's successor. According to tradition, the Pope's death will be ritually confirmed by Vatican officials and 9 days of mourning will be declared. Andrew West, host of Religion and Ethics Report on Radio National, is joining us tonight to discuss the next steps. Now, Andrew, a lot of ceremony and a lot of planning obviously goes into succession planning here. What happens, for those who don't understand the process so much, we know that there's 9 days of mourning, but a very important vote must ensue.
Yeah, well, in about 3 weeks, that's the conclave. Now, I think everyone's reference point now at the moment is a popular movie called Conclave, part of which I think gets it rather correct. There is a certain intrigue in it. It is a political process. Cardinals over the past few months, over the past few years, will almost certainly have been discussing with each other the characteristics of the next Pope. They will not necessarily coalesce in strict factions or quasi-parties, but there are certain common interests. The one thing that they really will have to consider is how the next Pope will handle the continuing crisis of sexual abuse. This is an area where Pope Francis was slow to act. When he did act, he acted quite dramatically, quite decisively, but was slow to act. This is an issue that will affect the question of where the next Pope comes from, because popes in the global south have not really dealt with the magnitude of the sexual abuse crisis in the way that European and American cardinals have. So that, or cardinals in the global south haven't had to do that, not with the same magnitude. Places like Chile, it's hit really very hard. Places like Africa, there's still a fair bit of denial. Places like South Asia, there's a bit of denial as well. It's in Europe where they've really had to come to grips with this. The question is to conclude that very important, gut-wrenching work of dealing with the sexual abuse crisis, a self-inflicted crisis, the biggest crisis to hit Catholicism since the Reformation. There's no question of that. Do they now seek a leader who has dealt with that in some ways? And that may mean a European, may even mean an American Pope. Unlikely, but it's possible.
There might be people out there hearing you saying that and thinking that they have been extremely unimpressed with the establishment's treatment of this issue over decades, and a fresh perspective might actually be a good thing.
Yeah, and they'd be right to. They'd be right to think that. The question is, as I've said, do you go for a Pope who in his life as a cardinal or an archbishop hasn't really had to grapple with this? Just because you haven't grappled with it doesn't mean that it hasn't occurred. And that is the question hanging over potential popes from the global south.
But have the people who've grappled with it within the Catholic Church now, how do you rate the job they've actually done? And might there be some people out there?
Joe, you're spot on. It's a very mixed picture. There are cardinals in the United States, like Cardinal O'Malley of Boston, who headed up the special papal task force on the abuse of minors and other vulnerable people. He's very well aware of the task that remains ahead of any new pope. As for others who have been less responsive, I couldn't name them necessarily, but I can assure you it's got to be a key consideration when the cardinals are considering a successor.
How significant will it be that this is the first conclave where non-European cardinals outnumber the European cardinals?
Very significant. And again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but again it emphasises where is the church growing? And the church is growing, but it's growing in Africa, it's growing in South Asia, it's growing in Southeast Asia, and it may well be growing in China. It's very difficult to get a grasp on the figures in China. There's about 14 to 15 million official Catholics in China. There may be many, many more under the radar. So your question is an important one, Catherine. But it's not one that I can answer conclusively.
No,
it's not one that I can answer.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, Andrew, you mentioned where Catholicism is growing in the world, but if you look at here in Australia in the last census, 20% of Australians are Catholic. The 2021 census showed that the Catholicism decreased to 20%, and it was up at 22.6% in 2016.
Yeah, it's holding its own in terms of raw numbers. Catholicism. The same in the United States. That is due largely to immigration. It is due largely, our biggest immigrant source countries are India and the Philippines, and to some extent China, I believe. So that is what is keeping numbers quite respectable. You wouldn't say it's strong, but respectable numbers. As a proportion of the population, Christianity has dipped below 50%. So, yes, in countries like the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, although the United Kingdom has reported a slight blip in Christian observance recently, you know, they will be looking for a pope who will tap into the multicultural growth of these countries. That is why a global South Pope might work for Australian Catholics in a way, especially if he reflects, you know, the cultures from which a lot of Australian immigrants come.
Okay, we'll leave it there for the moment, Andrew, but we will come back to you. Claudio Betti is the director of the Rome campus of the Australian Catholic University, and he joins us now from Rome. Claudio Betti, welcome. Just first of all, give us an insight into the depth of feeling within the Catholic congregation about Pope Francis.
Ciao from Rome. It is difficult to say because it is a news that just is passing around. Of course, it's a Monday of the Angel, and that means that most of the people are still at home. I've seen a huge number of people starting to walk towards St. Peter. So I think that it's slowly making its way into the mind of people that the Pope has died. Having seen him yesterday made everyone think that that the worst had already passed, but unfortunately it was not so.
Makes this even more of a shock, isn't it, Claudio, given that it was only in the last day that he was seen at the Easter Mass?
Yeah, and then meeting the Vice President of the United States. I mean, something that he would not have done if there were problems, heavy problems. So we do not know, nobody knows what has happened, but it is a shock.
And Claudio, tell us about the impact of Pope Francis on the Catholic Church over the term of his papacy. What do you think marks his legacy?
Look, if I may, I would like to go back to an image that probably you still remember. But you remember during the COVID pandemic, there was on a rainy night in Rome, Pope Francis alone was praying in Piazza San Pietro, completely empty. And he was talking about the fact that we are on the same boat. I think it is probably the most important moment, which is a meaningful moment of his papacy. Why I say this? Because Pope Francis has been trying desperately throughout his pontificate to move away from a world that is continuously praising the I, the me, the I, the ego, towards a new we. And that is, I think, that most the greatest legacy. Think about it. For ecology, Laudato Si, or Fratelli Tutti, or the meeting with the great Imam of Al-Azhar. Everything, or by the way, his last declaration on peace. He was a prophet of peace in a world that probably talks a completely different language. So I think that this was the main, moving from the I to the we was one of the main drives of this papacy.
He was also pushing for a we when it comes to the internal machinations of the Catholic Church, wasn't he? And to what extent has he been successful at that?
Well, that is, of course, you're perfectly right, Joe. The idea of synodality is a clear example of the fact that the church cannot be an aggregation of I's, but needs to be a we. I'm not sure that the process, the synodal process that was began last year, I think, has reached a final solution. However, I think that it has started, and I think that is one of the issues that the new Pope, whoever he may be, will have to deal with that. How to create a we that is not only a worldwide we, but it is also a church that talks as a we and not as an agglomeration of I's.
Claudio, we are hearing from numerous world leaders who are paying tribute to Pope Francis, both here in Australia with our Prime Minister as well as opposition leader. But many UK and European politicians are leading their tributes, saying he was a Pope full of compassion and great leadership.
Yeah, surely. I must say, he probably didn't get along with all world leaders. I think that most of the time he had some very harsh words for most of them, I would say. But of course, now, of course, we are just after a death, so we have to expect that. I think that his legacy will go on and will probably affect worldwide politics more than we think. Because it did touch the heart of the people, and that was really matters more than policy and politics. It is how to change the hearts, and I think that was the Pope wanted. And you can see it from the way I've seen pictures moving, and you can see meeting the poor, meeting the people with disability, talking about migrants, working for peace. These are things that remain in the heart of people more than empty political words.
And speaking of that, how symbolic do you think it was that one of the last things we saw the Pope do was go to the prisons and meet the prisoners? He didn't, in previous years, he has washed the feet of the prisoners. He wasn't in a position to do that this year because of his health. But what did you make of that?
Look, he opened a holy door in that same prison. And that means that pilgrims in Rome could have the indulgence walking through a door that it's open in a jail. I think that this is a very clear example of the way that Pope Francis was thinking and of all his spiritual life, where the excluded are, and it doesn't matter if they're guilty or not. For the Church, everybody deserves to be considered and loved. And this is something that will will definitely have to be the next part of the next Pope background. It cannot be a completely different one.
He also, Claudio, was considered to be socially progressive when it came to women, promoting many women to senior leadership positions in the Vatican.
Oh, yes, and causing some hiccups in the structure, I would say, but definitely he has made the women secretaries of dicasteries. That means that it's the highest possibility without being a cardinal or a bishop. So that has never happened before. And that too, I think, will also be a very important thing that needs to be done by the next Pope.
And you mentioned there, your phrase was it caused a few hiccups in the structure. Give us an insight into that and the forces or the people and the thinking that he challenged within the Church when he was Pope.
Well, again, I start from the very beginning of his papacy, when he said that the church cannot be a fortress, but needs to be a field hospital. That is something that clashes with a lot of with a ecclesiastical culture that has been present in our Catholic Church for a long time. And I think that that is what the Pope wants, and what the Pope wanted all along, being there in the streets. So don't be close into sacristies, but go there, go out. I think in Italian it's a sentence that sounds much better than in English. La Chiesa in uscita, and I think it's translated the church in that goes out, outgoing church. It is much stronger in Italian. La Chiesa in uscita is the church that goes out, that doesn't remain closed into its churches or its sacristies, but goes out where the people are. And I think that this is clearly an example of something that breaks the structure, the administration, every bureaucracy, as the Catholic Curia is, as a bureaucracy. And in that case, these words are clearly against that.
Yeah, it does sound so much better in Italian. There are so many things that sound better in Italian, Claudio. And can I just push you on that a little? And are you willing to offer a personal perspective on that? What do you think of the way that he tried to guide the church in terms of that, getting the church out into the streets?
Now, as I met him a couple of times, I think that he comes from a world that has no half measures. Can I say that? I'm not sure if it's correct word in English. And also he knew that he had a short time, and the church needed to be reformed. That's something that he said during the congregation, the Congregazioni Generali, which are the general congregation that will take place also now, where all the cardinals explain what their program is. So this is, and it probably was elected because of this idea that he had. And I think that, personally, I think that he did as much as he could, finding resistance. I am sure that there are people who resisted, and of course it's not for me to say who resisted, but you probably know where I'm going there. But at the same time, he also found a lot of people that supported him.
So interestingly then, Claudio, the vote will obviously happen with the conclave. The cardinals will need to vote there. Do you think that they are going to be voting for the continuation of Pope Francis's legacy, or will they be looking to rewind some of that, backtrack it, or for change?
Now, the conclave is a very complex structure, especially in a church that has now, I think, 126 cardinals from, or a little bit more than that probably, from 76 different countries. Most of these cardinals have never met one another. And that is something that is very new, because the previous conclaves were much more homogeneous, and people did know each other. But this one is going to be difficult because they're coming from 76 different countries. They're not people who know each other have never known each other before. And for example, the Pope has not elected as a cardinal the bishops of the big cities. He has made it almost as a point for his, but he nominated people from East Timor, and which is very strange, I must say. But so we will have to see how the congregation, the general congregation go. And I think that it would be very difficult to see someone that is completely against what Pope Francis has been doing until now. Of course, he has elected, I think, 75% of the number of the cardinals that are going to take place take place in the conclave. So it would be probably very difficult for something completely different to happen.
And Claudia, I just want to take you back to something you casually mentioned a couple of minutes ago, and that's was that you'd met the Pope a couple of times. Can you take us back to those conversations that you had with him? Because he comes across in these public appearances as someone who is incredibly warm, is able to establish connections with people of all standings, and is pretty down to earth. In your meetings with him, was he like that, or was it in a kind of a more formal situation?
No, it was very, very informal. I had met him a couple of times, one in Assisi when he met some Jewish leaders from Israel, the rabbis from Israel, and he was talking to me because I had no kippah, and he said to me, well, you're a Jew, you should wear a kippah. No, I'm not a Jew, and you don't wear a beard. So I said, no, but I am not a rabbi, so I don't need neither the kippah nor the beard. And the second time was at the end of a conference on Catholic education. And although I was the 250th person that he had to meet that morning, the last one really, he did spend a long time with me debating on the issue of Catholic education.
Debating on what in particular?
No, because I told him we need to educate more, and we need to create to be more advanced, more on the proclamation of a Christian culture or Catholic culture. And he said, of course we need to. And of course I told him that thank you for the fact that you've said that we are on the same boat, I think, and he appreciated that very much.
Claudio, through these interactions that you had with him, what would you say made him tick? Really got him going, got him passionate?
The children, as you can see, are one, and then the poor. The poor, he loves them to aware. I mean, every year he hosts a lunch for the poor at the Vatican, and he attends to that. He attended to that lunch, and he sat with the poor, he debated with them, he discussed with them. He really loves that, and I think it was what made him tick. The poor, and the wounded, and the poor were the little brothers of Jesus, I would say. And he understood that.
Yeah, and Spider-Man. And to what extent do you think he was more embraced the poor and was more compassionate with the poor than previous popes? Because isn't that something we hear from the Catholic Church over and over, is care for everyone, but he took it a step further?
Oh, well, because as probably someone else said it before, he used to go to the poor neighborhoods when he was already Archbishop of Buenos Aires. So it was part of they were part of his life before, and they never stopped being part of his life. In this, but I'm saying this doesn't mean that the Church has never done that. I think that the Church has always proclaimed that the Church needs to be on the side of the poor. This would have been, and all the popes before him. I remember Pope Benedict visited a soup kitchen. John Paul was a man who preferred to stay with the poor than with most of the powerful of the world. So I think that it's not. He made it his personal task, almost physically, which is probably the difference, surely between him and Pope Benedict, and to a certain extent also with Pope John Paul.
Claudio Betti, it's been great speaking with you. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences and insight.
It was great to talk to you. Ciao, Kath. Ciao, Joe.
That was Claudio Betti there, Director of the Rome campus of the Australian Catholic University.
Let's go now to East Asia correspondent Kathleen Calderwood, who's in Taipei. Kathleen, what can you tell us about the extent of the Catholic Church in Taiwan?
Well, look, the Catholic Church is a relatively small concern here, but no doubt this will be felt by Catholics here in Taiwan, some of which will likely be Chinese people who live here in Taiwan, because the Catholic Church in China does exist in a very sort of difficult position. Pope Francis actually forged an agreement with the Communist Party some years ago about the appointment of Catholic bishops there. As Andrew mentioned earlier, China is the only or one of the only places where the Vatican doesn't have the sole responsibility for appointing bishops, and the Pope did recently renew this with Beijing and has had appointed more bishops since the renewal of that agreement. But the Church there, they estimate there's at least 12 million Catholics officially in China, but there is also an underground Catholic Church in China, so it is quite hard to know exactly how many Catholics exist there. So I expect that we will see at the churches here in Taiwan, of course, masses and acknowledgements of the Pope's passing. Some of those, and I'll be very interested to see how many of those people are Chinese Catholics who are potentially freer here to be able to attend Mass and express those condolences themselves. But this will be deeply felt really across Asia. Of course, places like the Philippines and East Timor have some of the largest populations of Catholics in the world. In the Philippines, for example, nearly 80% of people are Catholic, more than 85 million people. And the Pope actually visited the Philippines in 2015, so a decade ago, and that trip is being remembered today very fondly. I've been seeing some reporting of his visit from 2015, people talking about how he, as we've heard, his great concern for the poor and people living in poverty, how that he exemplified that during that trip to the Philippines in 2015. He met with survivors of a 2013 super typhoon Yolanda, and at the time it's being remembered that he actually wore like a yellow poncho over his papal robes when giving Mass in Tacloban. People reporting there saying that really exemplified how he was a Pope who wanted to stay close to the people. He didn't expect special treatment or some kind of VIP approach to him giving Mass because of the heavy rain, that he was happy to wear a normal poncho or raincoat like anyone else there who was attending Mass might have been. Now, we have heard from the president of the Catholic Bishops Conference in the Philippines, Cardinal Pablo Virgilio David, who said he was deeply shocked by this news, and he has called for churches across the country to ring bells for the late Pope tonight, saying, "Let us please ring the bells of our churches and call our people to prayer for the eternal repose of the Holy Father, Pope Francis." We've also heard from the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who's posted on social media photos of him meeting with the Pope, saying that he's deeply pained to hear of his passing. He says that he offers his heartfelt condolences to the global Catholic community and that he will be remembered as a beacon of compassion, humility and spiritual courage by millions across the world. Pope Francis had visited Asia a couple of times in the last few years. Of course, last year he went to Papua New Guinea, East Timor, Singapore and Indonesia, but the year before that he'd also gone on a tour of Asia, notably visiting Mongolia, a mainly Buddhist country, but that was really seen as an opportunity to outreach to Chinese Catholics, and he was greeted there by many, many people very eager to see him and to hear him give Mass in Mongolia.
Kathleen Calderwood joining us from Taipei. Many thanks.
If you're just joining us, it's just gone midday in Rome. Pope Francis, history's first Latin American pontiff, has died. He was 88. The Vatican announced the news in a video statement saying his entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and of his church.
Cardinals will now be summoned to Rome to choose Francis's successor. According to tradition, the Pope's death will be ritually confirmed by Vatican officials and 9 days of mourning will be declared.
Well, journalist, broadcaster and ABC Radio National host Geraldine Doogue joins us now. Geraldine, welcome. So first off, give us an insight into the depth of feeling around the world, among Catholics in particular, for Pope Francis at this moment.
Oh, well, I think it's profound shock, and I think this will really grow. I've already had people coming to me who are not Catholics saying, we really liked that man and we will really miss him. Look, I think I did say to people, I think he'll hang on until after Easter. It's Easter Monday. It's amazing, really.
Why was that so important?
Look, I had no idea. I was taking advice from friends who were sort of doctors, that I just felt that man, I thought, to get through Easter, the power of this extraordinary ritual in the life of the church, I felt that he would hang on for grim death. Now, the fact that he didn't, he was told to take 2 months off completely. Well, I saw him wheel out into that St. Peter's, and I thought, that doesn't look to me like somebody who's actually stepping right back, you know. He received J.D. Vance, he received the King and Queen of England, but I wonder whether he thought, blow it. I'm not going to be half alive. I'm in the Lord's hands, and I will be either, I'll go when he wants me to go. He was very much a man who needed people. I was just reading something again recently. When he had a particularly bad period after the whole Pinochet with in Argentina, and he fell out with fellow Jesuits, and he was sort of sent to purgatory, to a place in outer Argentina. And he, for 18 months, I just read about it recently, he was devastated. He was right down low. It was a dark night of the soul for him. And he was away from people, and he hated that. And he's a man of people. Mm. And I suspect that being told that he had to sort of quietly rest, I think that was possibly the very last thing he intended to hear, whatever it took.
I'd like to welcome our viewers here to ABC TV on this special edition coverage of the passing of Pope Francis. We will be on air with you for the next 2 hours or so, and Geraldine Doog joins us now in the studio for her assessment of the passing. You mentioned the shock there. That's what we've been speaking about a lot, given we only saw him on the balcony at St. Peter's just 24 hours ago. A lot of us, there's a lot of world leaders weighing in with their tributes right now. For you, what is your personal opinion on what the legacy of Pope Francis will be?
Look, for me, it is that he tried to genuinely implement Vatican II, which was this big meeting from 1962 to 65 to try to sort of bring the church into the world of the 20th century, and now we're in the 21st. And I feel that he really tried to say, I do not want a clerical church. I want a church where everybody is welcome, but everybody takes responsibility for that church. There's a sort of a great line, pay, pray and obey is the sort of little trope that a lot of Catholics were told to have. Someone else will run the church. You go away and do your little bit. Don't you worry about that, dear. Well, and a lot of us, to be quite candid, I think we're quite happy about that. We wanted someone else to run the place. Well, he's really saying, no, that's not going to be good enough. Apart from the fact they haven't got enough people putting their hands up to be ordained people, so laity have got to come in. But I think he was really saying, I want an altogether different feeling church. Now, that put him against, I remember talking to Joe about this when we last talked, when it looked like he was going to die 6 weeks ago. A lot of people, for instance, in the US, bitterly opposed this. They did not want an unwinding of the church that they had known. They were much more into sort of linear authority, doctrinal purity. In fact, it'll be very interesting to see how this whole event will be reported in the US in the next 24 to 36 hours. Fascinating, because he had a lot of enemies there.
And Geraldine, from what you just said then, it sounded like you were one of those people who were happy enough with it being a clerical church, with the decisions being made at the time. Am I right?
I was, but then I changed my mind.
Was it Pope Francis who changed your mind, or did that happen before?
That happened before, to be candid. And in a way, that happened. I mean, I was, sort of school and university when Vatican II happened. I watched the nuns change before my very eyes during that time, and I started to realise there was another possible church. And then, if anything, it went a little backwards, I would say, under JP, John Paul II and Benedict. And look, I'm not here to, there are all sorts of different ways you can examine this multifarious thing called the Catholic Church, but I feel that drawing towards welcoming wider varieties of talents into this grand old institution,
including women at higher ranks,
including women, is it's vital. And look, most of our institutions have had to learn to include a wider range of talents, and the church is no different.
I want to pick up on your point that you just touched on there, Geraldine, about the US reporting of this. We know that there was a long-standing, I guess, unease with the Trump administration. How do you expect the reporting to play out and why?
That is a fascinating question, Catherine. I think J.D. Vance will be very interesting to watch because he just met the Pope very recently, and it'll be profound, I think, for that man. I mean, I don't know quite what to make of that man, to be candid, but I think to have met a man of this stature and then to see him drop dead will be something that'll affect J.D. Vance. So I'm waiting for that. Nobody's got to him yet, to the best of my knowledge. I think Trump will be ambivalent, actually. Now, he likes people, almost kings and queens and people in great authority. He'll be utterly respectful, of course, but, there are people around him like Steve Bannon who, frankly, thought that, Francis was bringing the church down to its knees. So it'll be quite a challenge, in my opinion, the majority of Catholics voted for Trump in that recent election. Like the idea that we have grown up with here, that, Catholics are more intuitively drawn to a progressive or a Labor side, whether you call it progressive, a Labor side of politics. And that's, of course, changed. Well, in America, that's a bit different. So I think it'll be truly fascinating to see how Trump handles it.
And Geraldine, you mentioned there that you thought his primary legacy was going to be that the effort to change the structure of decision making within the church to elevate the laity. Just looking from outside the church, what do you think his legacy will be internationally and outside the church?
Look, I've thought about that. He was very strong on peace, as you know, calling for peace. But there were, and migrants, very much. And of course, that's a very Jesuitical emphasis on welcoming the stranger. But people had started to say, just recently after his autobiography came out, said, he was being a little bit of a populist. He could have actually tried to delve a bit more deeply into the dilemmas that this is bringing, unchecked migration, the business of bringing peace. That's not easy. And in a way, he sort of said, some people might say he was too predictable in that respect.
It has laid the groundwork for perhaps that next step, would you say?
Yes, I would say that. And maybe one of his huge legacies for people outside the Catholic Church will be his encyclical Laudato Si, which is about the environment. Now, a lot of people, especially young people, have been drawn in to really believe the earth is a sacred duty for us to protect. And the Catholic Church, like a lot of Christian churches, has been a bit ambivalent about this. That sounded a bit like the old religion sort of thing, worshipping the earth, that wasn't what we did. And in a way, he fundamentally threw himself into it and said, this is our sacred duty. If we don't protect the earth, we won't have anywhere to worship. He was adamant about that. So I actually think that might be one of his big legacies.
Just before we were going to go to a separate segment, but I want to make sure that you're going to be able to stay with you because I wanted to ask you something else. You don't have to leave now, do you?
Not immediately. Not immediately.
Okay, well, we'll get back to Geraldine in a moment. Now, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, has released a tribute to the late Pope Francis. Let's take a listen.
On behalf of the Coalition, I express my condolences to Australians of Catholic and Christian faith upon the very sad news of the death of the 266th Pontiff. His Holiness Pope Francis served God with the utmost devotion throughout his life. He was the first Pope from the Jesuit order and the first Latin American Pope. He lived frugally and simply. Above all else, he was driven by Christ's values of mercy and forgiveness. He emphasised those values in his last Christmas address, saying, and I quote, "God's mercy can do all things. It unties every knot. It tears down every wall of division. God's mercy dispels hatred and the spirit of revenge. With God, may Pope Francis rest in peace."
Opposition leader Peter Dutton there. Well, the French President Emmanuel Macron has also released a statement. It reads, "From Buenos Aires to Rome, Pope Francis wanted the Church to bring joy and hope to the poorest, to unite people with one another and with nature. May this hope, be reborn endlessly beyond him. To all Catholics, to a grieving world, my wife and I send our thoughts."
King Charles has also released a statement saying he was most deeply saddened about the death of Pope Francis, sending his most heartfelt condolences and profound sympathy to the Church he served with such resolve. Charles, the head of the Church of England, which split from Rome in 1534, and his wife Queen Camilla met Pope Francis in the Vatican just earlier this month.
Well, Miles Pattenden is a Catholic historian whose research explores diverse Catholic cultures which have flourished over the past millennium. He is currently the Program Director at European. He joins us now from Oxford in the UK. Good evening to you. Thank you for your time.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on the show.
Miles, what are your first recollections and reactions to the passing of Pope Francis?
Well, my first reaction to Pope Francis's passing is that this is a deeply sad moment for over 1 billion Catholics all around the world. He was a hugely important figure in the history of Catholic Christianity, the first Jesuit pope, the first Latin American pope, but mostly he was a man who restored the papacy's reputation for compassion and charity and humility after quite a difficult period earlier this century. And a lot of Catholics are going to feel his loss very, very badly.
How did he practically achieve that?
I think he achieved that through his example. He was a man who went out there and met people. He did some extraordinary things which 50 years ago one couldn't have imagined a pope doing, like hugging a man who had facial disfigurement, letting a little boy sit on his papal throne. There were all kinds of small and simple gestures which broadcast to the wider world that he was one of us. And he was thinking about us, and that he saw the papacy as a pastoral ministry, which was very important.
He also, Miles, in the last few months, most particularly, was this visible example of a dignified suffering in those final months.
Yes, again, I think that was a very important thing for many Catholics who themselves felt a great deal of compassion for the Pope, who was clearly willing himself to continue despite the growing physical difficulties and infirmities in which he found himself. And again, that example of how we should face our own impending demise was very powerful and very important for lots of spiritual people, not just Catholics, but I think across all Christian denominations and world religions, who naturally think about these things. And the fact that the Pope still wanted to be visible was very important.
And in the history and the context of the history of the Church, why was it so important at this time during Francis's papacy that he restore that notion of the Church as a compassionate institution?
Well, the Church in the 20th century and the 21st has had a problem with accusations of what's called clerisy, the idea that it's run for the benefit of priests, that they're unaccountable, that it's extremely hierarchical. And Francis was the first pope to really say, no, that's not the Church that I want. There, of course, have been a lot of scandals during the pontificate of Benedict XVI, especially surrounding child sexual abuse all around the world and of course, in Australia. And Francis was the first pope who, in a way, said, yes, I get it, I'm sorry, we need to do better about this. And although his record on this wasn't completely perfect, the fact that he was prepared to make a stand and to say he understood people's anger and the trauma that many victims have felt, that was very important, I think, for resetting relations between the Church hierarchy and the rest of humanity.
We've been speaking, Miles, at length tonight about the work that he has done on numerous issues, higher education, LGBTQ plus areas. But where would you say the work that is unresolved? Where has he left an open book for those to take up from him now?
I would say that Francis's work is unresolved in all of the areas that you've just described. He has advanced the Church's position on gay rights with his famous comment, well, who am I to judge? And his suggestion that sexual practices are no worse a sin than any other category of sin in the Catholic Church's language. He's made some advances for the position of women in the Church as well, but of course we still don't have a pathway to women deacons, let alone women priests, that the matter will still be on the table for the next Pope. And Francis's approach to this was very much to try to seek consensus, to try to get the laity to move things forward and to reveal what their preferences were, in the hope that that could persuade more of the Vatican hierarchy to move faster in reforms. The same is also true with his legacy on the environment, that Francis made this the centre of his papacy in a certain way, with his important encyclical Laudato Si on this. But it's not necessarily clear that the Church's overall position has changed very much. And there was a sense, I felt, in the last 2 or 3 years that Francis had not really adapted his teachings on this subject to the direction in which global debate was going, particularly the move towards thinking about, well, what are the trade-offs from environmental policy and how do we mitigate environmental change and damage rather than trying to stop it outright. So, there was a limitation to what he had to say on these subjects, which needs to be developed by the next Pope if the Catholic Church is going to continue to evolve its policies.
And speaking of the next Pope, to what extent is it likely that the next Pope will think along the same lines as Francis, or will there be a pushback and a more conservative Pope?
Well, there's a famous Roman saying that he who goes into a conclave of Pope comes out a cardinal, that it's very, very difficult to predict what the cardinals will decide when they meet in a few weeks' time. I mean, since Francis has appointed most of the cardinals who will have voting rights in this conclave, it's quite likely that the Pope will be at least sympathetic to his predecessor's legacy. But it's very difficult to predict because the cardinals make their decision on all kinds of factors, not simply the straightforward politics of the thing.
Miles Patterton, Catholic historian, joining us from Oxford in the UK there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's take you now to St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney, where Archbishop Anthony Fisher has been speaking.
I might just start by telling you a little bit of my own experience of Pope Francis. I met him probably about a dozen times over the years, maybe more than that, at least once a year and sometimes a few times a year. And my most recent communication with him was only last week when I got a letter from him appointing me to another job in Rome. And I always found him very easy to talk to, very informal, rather like an Australian in that respect. And one particular memory I have was 3 years ago when I went to Rome for a meeting when I had just buried my mother, and I was there the following week for a meeting, and when I went to shake his hand in the line of people meeting him, he immediately said to me, "My condolences on the death of your mum." And that he knew that she had died and that he cared was really quite remarkable. He would have been meeting 1,000 people a day, and it was very moving for me. So we have lost in Pope Francis a great pastor, a man who was a true priest and bishop and pastor for the whole church, and he'll be sorely missed by millions, billions of Catholics around the world. Over to you.
How would you describe the Pope's connection with Australia?
Pope Francis sadly never came to Australia, and we were hoping that he might come for the International Eucharistic Congress in 2028, which he appointed Australia to host late last year. So I think that was on his mind, that he would make his trip to Australia. He got very close in getting to Papua New Guinea and East Timor only last year, and I think he did want to make his way here. He was, of course, a pope of the Southern Hemisphere. That's very unusual, the first pope of the Southern Hemisphere. And he did get to some other parts of the Southern Hemisphere but didn't get here. He appointed in the Synod of Bishops last year a hugely disproportionate number of Australians. There were many, many more Australians than you'd expect for our numbers as a Catholic country. In fact, we had about the same number as the United States had at the Synod, even though they would have 10 times as many Catholics as us. So that's a sign, I think, of a certain affection for Australia and the Australian way of thinking about things, that he chose so many to be at the Synod last year.
How do you think all of the Australian Catholics are doing at the moment and coming to terms with this?
Well, I would guess many will only hear it when they hear the news in the morning. They won't even know tonight when they go to bed. But the word will be getting around, certainly in the social media, and some of them watching the late night news and people ringing each other to tell each other. I think that there will be grief and gratitude. We had him to the age of 88. He could well have died well before now. People thought he would die a month or two ago. We got a bit of extra time with him, as it were, at the end, and he even got to give his last Easter message yesterday. So I think there'll be gratitude for that and for all he's done for the Church over the last 12 years. But there'll also be grief. That a lot of people loved him dearly and they will miss him as our chief pastor in the Catholic Church.
What will the coming days look for St Mary's and all the other Catholic churches right across the country?
So there will be many, many masses offered for him, for the repose of his soul, for his receiving a heavenly reward, and of course for the Church going forward as well. And I'll be saying one of those masses tomorrow. I think I'll be doing the lunchtime mass here at St Mary's, and there'll be many more offered here at St Mary's and in churches right around the country. I think too that we can presume that other Christians and other people of faith, of all faiths, will be praying with us. I've already received messages tonight from Jewish and Muslim leaders of condolence. So I think it will be all Australians that will share in the grief of Catholics that we have lost our chief pastor. And I think it's a sign of something very beautiful about Australia, that we do share in each other's griefs and joys when they come.
What do you think about the timing of Pope Francis's passing to eternal life, coming on Easter Monday, just after we celebrated the Lord's Resurrection?
Yes. I think his dying at Easter is very special. Now, some of us will remember, the older ones here will remember, 20 years ago, Pope John Paul was dying at Easter and died very soon after Easter. And his long suffering was a great sign to us of dignity in suffering and in old age. And I think that Pope Francis has given similar witness, that he persevered through his old age and sickness, kept trying to serve God and serve people to the end. And for him to die at Easter is very special because, as he said himself yesterday, this is when we Christians celebrate eternal life. We celebrate our belief that we will live on after our death. And he now is experiencing exactly what he preached about yesterday, the truth, the mercy, the goodness, the life, the love of God that is expressed in his raising his Son from the dead, and in due course raising all of us from the dead. Okay. Thank you for coming out tonight.
And that's where Archbishop Anthony Fisher, speaking there from Sydney, commenting on the passing of the Pope and talking about the importance of him to people in this region of the world. And we've got Geraldine Doog here with us, who's a journalist and broadcaster and also a Catholic, a passionate Catholic. And it was just interesting there, Geraldine, to hear the Archbishop talking about the extraordinary number of delegates that were sent from Australia, chosen from Australia to go to the Synod. But am I right in saying the Pope didn't decide to appoint a cardinal from Australia?
Quite right, Joe, he did not. And there was a little bit of surprise about that, but he appointed people from the peripheries. I mean, this was his obsession, was to say this is a genuinely multinational church, and it has been too Europe-focused. And a lot of the growth is in those peripheries, you know, the Africas of this world. China is it'll be very interesting to see what the Chinese response is too, by the way. And he didn't appoint a cardinal, an Australian cardinal, but that's exactly what he was like. He'd say, yes, but I clearly showed you that I was terribly interested in your church, and your plenary council had made a very big impact on the shape of that synod. But he wanted to symbolically say, I am more than white people and Europeans. And accordingly, he appointed all of these, very different cardinals.
And symbolically, that extended to with what we saw in the Asia Pacific tour in 2024, him visiting Indonesia, East Timor, Papua New Guinea as well.
And Singapore, that's right. And he didn't come down here. We were all ready, Compass we were ready for him to come down, and he just decided not to. Now, even then, I did think that he might just do that little bit of extra. See, I don't even think he was terribly well then.
Only last year.
That's right. And I mean, do you remember it was the Royal Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, took him into those mountainous regions of Papua New Guinea. So look, he was a fascinating man trying to spread a different message about the church.
And Geraldine was particularly interested with Anthony Fisher's announcing there that he had been appointed for a job in Rome, and we'll get to that with Geraldine in a moment.
I was fascinated about that.
Just say that's where we leave ABC viewers on the main channels around the nation. If you want to continue watching our coverage of the Pope, you can switch over to the ABC News channel.
Well, let's stick with our coverage now of the passing of Pope Francis. And Geraldine, before we let you go, I thought it was quite poignant there that the Archbishop Anthony Fisher was asked questions about the timing of the Pope's passing, given it being Easter Sunday.
Extraordinary.
Would Catholics find comfort in that? What would they feel about the timing?
It just feels so right. I had a little instinct and said to people, I think he might hang on for Easter Sunday. There's a certain sort of bringing it, after the travail of the Good Friday and Holy Saturday to come to Easter Sunday and for him to go. I don't know, there's something terribly appropriate, terribly right about that. I think a lot of people will find genuine comfort in that.
And Geraldine, just before you go, I want to see if we can bring up a live shot from St Peter's Square now, because you've no doubt been there many times, and as a Catholic, you're deeply affected by what's going on at the moment. And I'm just interested to hear from you, how you feel right now, and how do you feel you would love to be there in Rome for this, and how you feel about the legacy of Pope Francis?
Well, look, I think I will be there very shortly.
Yeah?
I think I'm going to be there very fast. Look, it is an extraordinary place to be. It is terribly exciting. And I remember when he walked out when he was proclaimed Pope, and he came out with that amazing, simple, Fratelli e Sorelle, buonasera. I mean, I'll never forget that moment. It was wonderful. And all the Romans just get so involved in it, and he had very much that human touch. It'll be quite a place to be. You're sort of overpowered by the scale of the architecture and the beauty of it. And then this business of who rules next.
The white smoke and the black
and
smoke.
The white smoke, and sort of time after, you say, another grey smoke, and then suddenly you find yourself thinking, somebody says, hey, I think there's going to be white smoke. I mean, I don't know how they know this, because it's completely silent.
And what do you think of the job he did?
Oh, I think he did a fantastic job. I mean, I think he was a very strong Pope. I really do. And I thought, I never met him, but I think that he fundamentally moved the church into the 21st century and renovated it. That's maybe not a good term, but he made it more open to a lot of different people to come in, and I just think that's fundamentally going right back to the man at the start.
So, Jerry, then do you have concerns about who the next Pope might be, and whether or not there will be continuation of the work that you've been pleased with, or we might see something totally different?
We might see something totally different. I mean, it's easier to pick the Melbourne Cup than to pick the next Pope. Look, we don't know. Intuitively, I think that those people from the periphery, I met a few of them last year, I think they'll go for, oddly enough, an Italian. I think they'll settle it down. But I may be so wrong. We'll see.
All right, Jerry, you are sticking around with us for the next half hour or so, I believe. So thank you. Because,
my pleasure.
We'll leave it there with you just for this moment. And we'll bring in our correspondent, Michelle Rimmer, who is in London. We've been speaking with you, Michelle, over the past hour and a half or 2 hours since this news broke. What is the reaction that you're seeing on that side of the world?
So we're hearing reports that there are people crying in the street outside St Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. All Italian football matches have been cancelled. This is out of respect for the pontiff. And so very much Rome and Italy is a country in shock and in official period of mourning. However, much of the Catholic world is reflecting those same emotions, this feeling of shock after what's appeared to be an improvement in the pontiff's health. He spent around a month in hospital from February this year receiving treatment for double pneumonia, but we'd seen him out and about in the public in recent days, visiting one of Rome's most crowded prisons on Good Friday, and then again out meeting members of the public, babies, those that are gathered outside St Peter's Basilica on Easter Sunday. So this is an altogether really unexpected announcement this morning in this part of the world. We're having messages pour in from world leaders, including King Charles. A statement from Buckingham Palace has said that he looks back on his meetings with Pope Francis as recent as within the last 2 weeks. He said he looks back at them with fondness, and that he has particular affection for the pontiff and everything that he did. We've heard from the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. He said that Pope Francis's tireless efforts to promote the world that is fairer for all will leave a lasting legacy. The Spanish Prime Minister said that Pope Francis leaves a profound legacy, and the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni says that a great man has left us. So in this part of the world, there's been an outpouring of respect for Pope Francis and remembering his legacy, and also that of grief and mourning.
Michelle, from the guests we've been talking to, it seems there are two legacies they talk about. One is the legacy within the Catholic Church, trying to elevate the laity and get the laity involved in decision-making, and then outside the Catholic Church to bring it back to a reputation of compassion, considering the scandals and challenges the Church had been through over the last century. Is that you've been covering this story for quite some time now? Is that the impression that you get as well, that there are these two legacies, or others as well?
Yeah, so a really, I think, a big part of Pope Francis's legacy is that of compassion, as you mentioned, that of him being a man of the people. From the get-go, he chose the name Pope Francis, which is the saint of the poor. And he is really, throughout his time as pontiff, through his time leading the Catholic Church, he attempted to make it more inclusive. He had more women involved in decision-making. He would go out and meet people from all corners of the earth. He was quite vocal on issues including finding peaceful resolutions to conflict. Up until when he was receiving treatment in hospital, he was receiving and making calls with one of the priests in Gaza. So he was very much attuned to those conflicts going on in the world, and he was very involved up until his final days in spreading messages of peace and looking to, I guess, reform the Church's approach to some of these issues and looking at peaceful resolutions, looking at inclusivity. So that is really part of his lasting legacy, is that he was a man that tried to through his own actions, he led by example, and he went out and met people from all corners of the earth, regardless of their sexuality, their gender, and he made sure that they felt that they had a part and a place within the Catholic Church. And that's something that people are talking about today, and they were while I was in Rome and at the Vatican over the past few months while he was receiving treatment. They were the big reflection points, was that this was a man who not only wanted to see the Church move in a certain direction, but he lived that example. On Good Friday, he went to Rome's one of the most crowded prisons there and blessed inmates. So even when he was receiving instructions from his doctors to rest, he was out and he was meeting people, and some of those people that, you know, may feel excluded from society, the Pontiff made sure that he included them in his own preaching and his own actions, and so that is something that he'll be remembered for.
Michelle, world leaders have been paying tribute where you are. I'm reading on the BBC that the Union flag will fly half-mast over royal residences, including the palaces there. Keir Starmer has also put out a statement, as has the King. What are the general reflections coming from your part of the world?
So the general message is that of, I guess, respect for the pontiff and admiration for what he was able to achieve during his time in the role. Much of it is around the fact that he has been hailed for touching the lives of so many. They were the words of King Charles, who only 2 weeks ago met with the pontiff. So King Charles and Queen Camilla, they were on a state visit to Italy, and they actually weren't expected to meet with the pontiff because of his poor health. However, Pope Francis made time for them, and during that meeting they were able to reflect on their previous years together and talk about the future that they were hoping for. And so that's one note of reflection from King Charles, is that he has a heavy heart to learn this news, but that he sees the pontiff as having touched the lives of so many, and that he has particular affection for him. We've also heard from Ursula von der Leyen, who is the EU chief, and she said the same thing, that she had this respect for the pontiff and this great sadness. We're also hearing from the White House from the US. So the White House has released a statement saying, "Rest in peace, Pope Francis." And J.D. Vance, the Vice President, who actually met with Pope Francis on Easter Sunday just 24 hours ago, he also paid tribute after meeting Pope Francis and said that his heart goes out to him. So it's not just this part of the world, it's really all corners of the world that are stopping and taking a moment to reflect on Pope Francis, the man who's led the Catholic Church.
Michelle Rimmer joining us from London there. Thank you.
So Pope Francis will make his final journey along the road from Vatican City to the Esqui line, one of the 7 hills of Rome, where he decided to be buried in one last break from tradition. He's also opted for simpler funeral rites and will become the first pope in more than a century to be buried outside the Vatican. His chosen resting place is the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore.
The pontiff had said he decided to vastly simplify the elaborate funeral rites for a pope. His funeral is still expected to take place in St Peter's Square, in front of the Basilica of St Peter, where most of his predecessors rest. The last time a pope was buried outside the Vatican was in 1903.
And the Archbishop of Melbourne, Peter Andrew Comensoli, joins us now on the phone. Archbishop, welcome. First of all, your reflections on the passing of Pope Francis.
Thanks, Joe, and it's good to be able to speak with you and your people. It's a sad moment, certainly, but not entirely unexpected. Pope Francis has been suffering under real stress over a number of months now. This is all known to everyone. It's not entirely unexpected that at 88, and having gone through the great suffering that he's gone through in the last couple of months, that his death has come.
Do you think there was a real determination to hang on until Easter?
Who knows how that might have worked through, that God gave him the gift, the providence to do so is wonderful. That his last words to us, all to the world, were that Christ is risen, and to wish us a happy Easter. What a beautiful way to conclude his own ministry.
I guess also, Archbishop, it's Catherine Robinson here, that it would come as a shock to so many, given he was only spreading that message of peace just 24 hours ago.
Catherine, that might be true in terms of that it happened right now, given that there had been some signs that he may have been improving since the very serious and life-threatening time over the last couple of months. However, at 88, having suffered so much in these last, particularly these last few months, and he might come to this moment is at least for me, not surprising.
How do you think his papacy will be remembered?
In a few ways, Joe. where he came from is significant, I think. From Argentina, from quite challenged and difficult realities within, as he grew up himself, as he ministered as a priest, as a bishop, as an archbishop, all of those sort of aspects. That he came from Latin America, from the peripheries, is important to note, and the choice of the cardinals then to give to us someone who had come from the peripheries is really important. That he chose Francis of Assisi, that extraordinary saint who was a saint for the poor and for holding up the gift of the gospel to people, that he would then model his own time as Pope from that perspective is really important. And the last point I'd make is that a particular word of Pope Francis was very deeply important to him, and that's the word joy. Most of his statements began with the word joy, and we should not miss that.
Do you think he will also be remembered as someone, in terms of the structure of the church, someone who tried to elevate the laity in decision-making, and to what extent was he successful at that?
That was certainly a significant dimension of his time as Pope. But it should be remembered he's done that within the context of his own particular pastoral ministry as the leader of the church. Each of the recent popes have brought a certain characteristic, if you like. I think of John Paul, the great leader of the church through the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. A great philosopher, Pope Benedict, one of those very unique theologians who will be significant for decades and even centuries, I think. Pope Francis, what an extraordinary pastoral Pope he has been.
And Archbishop, how have you been, given we're only 2 hours into this news, consoling those Catholics around you? What stories are those people sharing with you?
People are saddened. Some people quite strongly saddened by his death. I think also people recognise that this was, in some regards, coming, given his very serious health issues in recent months. So it's not entirely a surprise. And I think also people will be grieving for the gift that he has been for us for these last 12 years, and looking now to offering their prayer for the cardinals as they now enter into this very significant moment for the cardinals of choosing a new pope.
Archbishop, another guest we've spoken to this morning has spoken of Pope Francis's compassion, and that's something that he will be remembered for, and you've touched on that already. But our other guests mentioned his compassion in terms of dealing with the challenges and the scandals that have beset the church in recent time, particularly sexual abuse. How do you think he will be remembered in terms of addressing challenges like that?
Like all of recent times, the popes have been confronted by this extraordinary scandal, this extraordinary wound that has affected so many individuals and their families, and then the communities within in which those people who have been abused have existed. This is a reality that is a deeply personal one for our own local church in Melbourne. The Pope Francis has took very significant steps to put in place structures that would deal with this more effectively. I would note that Pope Benedict himself did that. This is not something that is just Pope Francis, but it's been something that has been taken up more strongly by successive popes. And I would hope that the new Pope, whoever that will be, will not lose that impetus and that the encouragement to work for the recognition of those who have been abused, the putting in place of processes for the accountability and justice in regards to those who did abuse, and also for our processes within our local churches of ensuring that we have great structures for the care and the ongoing safeguarding of our children and vulnerable people.
Archbishop, you touched on the conclave and the cardinals that will be voting for the next Pope. We know that a Melbourne bishop, Mikola Bajczuk, is in that position where he will be involved in choosing the next Pope. A huge moment when it comes to that for him and his career as well, a huge decision for all these cardinals to be making.
Yes, a huge decision for them to make. I would caution around using the word career in this regard. Bishop Mikola has, as one of the cardinals, now recently appointed as one of the cardinals of the church, will, along with the rest, gather, I think, in the next week or so, they'll particularly gather to be present for the funeral of Pope Francis, and then they will move into a process of meetings amongst themselves, remembering that a lot of the cardinals are spread right across the world, and there's going to be a need for them to get to know one another, and then to consider who from amongst them might be the Pope that we need into the future. And this will now take place over the next few weeks or so.
And Archbishop Comensoli, did you have any personal interactions with the Pope yourself?
Indeed, I did. Thanks be to God. So I was present at one of the synods of the Church back in 2018, which took place over a month period, and that was on young people. And so I met and said hello to the Pope daily during that. I've had other occasions to meet with him. I've met one-on-one with him on one occasion, which was a very moving and powerful thing. And he offered the gift of meeting with a group of young people from Melbourne. So in 2023, the World Youth Day was taking place in Lisbon, in Portugal. And on the way, we took a group from Melbourne via Rome to go to that. And on spec, I wrote to Pope Francis and said, do you want to meet with a group of young people from Melbourne? And he said, yes. Extraordinary. And so we had an hour with him. And that time he just said, let them ask me questions. And that's what happened. So for an hour, our young people, about 100 of them, can't remember the exact number now, but they just put up their hands and said, and asked questions, and he responded to all of their questions. It was the most beautiful, beautiful gathering.
It's interesting because, Archbishop, there's a common thread running through here tonight, the people that we've speaking to who have met with the Pope before, and it's that generosity of spirit that comes through in the way that he is and spent his time with people, and it was that people who really energised him, it seemed.
Catherine, you've observed something rather correctly. It's really, I think that is well summed up by you.
Mm.
And you mentioned that you had a one-on-one meeting with him. Can you give us, obviously there was a private conversation, but in the context of this evening, what are your reflections on that one-on-one meeting?
So, yes, definitely. It was about a particular matter, and he listened. Firstly, he listened. How much is that a necessary thing for us all in our lives at this time, to listen? And then, having listened, he offered a few reflections as to what might be a way of approaching the matter that we discussed.
It's been wonderful of you to join us and share your thoughts and reflections, Archbishop of Melbourne, Peter Andrew Comensoli. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine and Joe.
And in the next hour, ABC Radio National will also be offering special coverage. Tune in for a compelling conversation exploring the legacy of Pope Francis and what his passing means for the Catholic Church, with religion experts Geraldine Doog, Andrew West and Noel DeBean. That's on ABC Radio National on your radio, or you can, of course, listen on the ABC Listen app.
And the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has offered his condolences to Catholics here and around the world. This is what he had to say earlier.
Today, the prayers of more than 1 billion people from all nations and every walk of life go with Pope Francis to his rest. Born in Argentina in 1936 and ordained a priest in 1969, Pope Francis' fellow cardinals elected him Pope in 2013. His was a papacy of firsts, the first Pope to hail from the Americas, the first Jesuit Pope, and the first to take the name of that great champion of the poor, St. Francis of Assisi. Pope Francis' compassion embraced all humanity, and today he will be mourned by Catholics and non-Catholics alike. He urged us to remember all we hold in common, and he asked the world to hear the cry of the earth, our common home. He invited world leaders to join him and, to quote him, emerge from the dark night of wars and environmental devastation in order to turn our common future into the dawn of a new and radiant day. He was very much a modernist. His message that he sent out echoed in our region during his historic visit to Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Singapore and Timor-Leste. The first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere was close to the people of Australia. For Australian Catholics, he was a devoted champion and loving father. Pope Francis lived out his faith and vocation in word and deed. He was truly inspirational. In his modest way of life and at his weekly audiences, he demonstrated his commitment to peace, equality and inclusion. Pope Francis's love for humanity was powerful and profound. The memory and example of his compassion will long endure. As we mourn his death, we celebrate the gift of his life and presence among us, and we hold on to the resonant truth of Pope Francis's final Easter homily. The light quietly shines forth, even though we are in darkness. The promise of new life and a world finally set free awaits us, and a new beginning, however impossible it might seem, can take us by surprise, for Christ has triumphed over death. May God welcome Pope Francis to eternal life. I have asked the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet that all flags from the Commonwealth Government of Australia will fly at half-mast tomorrow as a sign of respect. And my sincere condolences to everyone who, for tonight, it will be a very difficult evening. Thank you.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese speaking there earlier this evening, and the opposition leader Peter Dutton has paid his respects to Pope Francis, saying, above all else, he was driven by Christ's values of mercy and forgiveness.
The Governor-General, Sam Mostyn, has also released a statement. It says, as millions of Australian Catholics mourn a spiritual guide, father and friend, we can all reflect on His Holiness's message of peace, of respect for the rights and dignity of every member of our human family and care for the earth, our common home.
Leaders from across the world have responded to the announcement of the Pope's death. King Charles has released a statement saying, my wife and I were most deeply saddened to learn of the death of Pope Francis. Our heavy hearts have been somewhat eased, however, to know that His Holiness was able to share an Easter greeting with the Church and the world. He served with such devotion throughout his life and ministry. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has also reacted.
He said his tireless efforts to promote a world that is fairer for all will leave a lasting legacy. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has also paid his respects to the Pope, saying he knew how to give hope, ease suffering through prayer and foster unity.
And the White House has posted a picture of the Pope on X meeting President Donald Trump and another picture of the Pope meeting JD Vance yesterday. Rest in peace, Pope Francis, it says. If you're just joining us, welcome to our special coverage of the passing of Pope Francis. It's just past 1 p.m. in Rome. Pope Francis, history's first Latin American pontiff, has died. He was 88.
The Vatican announced the news in a video statement, saying his entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and His Church. Cardinals will now be summoned to Rome to choose Francis' successor. According to tradition, the Pope's death will be ritually confirmed by Vatican officials and 9 days of mourning will be declared.
Australia's political leaders have responded to the pontiff's death. National Affairs correspondent Jane Norman has more.
We are in uncharted territory here. A pope hasn't died during an election campaign in recent memory, but it's likely to, at the very least, cast a pall over tomorrow, campaign day 25. Both leaders are yet to confirm how they'll adapt their plans, but have already addressed the media.
The first pope from the Southern Hemisphere was close to the people of Australia. For Australian Catholics, he was a devoted champion and loving father. Pope Francis lived out his faith and vocation in word and deed. He was truly inspirational.
The news broke as the opposition leader was in the air flying to Orange. In a statement, he's expressed his condolences to Australians of Catholic and Christian faith.
His Holiness Pope Francis served God with the utmost devotion throughout his life. He was the first pope from the Jesuit order and the first Latin American pope. He lived frugally and simply. Above all else, he was driven by Christ's values of mercy and forgiveness.
The speed at which both campaigns have responded this evening indicated the Pope's death had been factored into both their contingencies.
And Pope Francis was the first Jesuit pope in the history of the Catholic Church. It had a significant impact on his papacy. David Braithwaite is a Jesuit priest with St Canis's parish in Sydney, and he joins us now. David Braithwaite, welcome. So first of all, your reflections on the passing of the Pope.
Well, like most people, I was deeply shocked to hear the news, even though maybe we shouldn't have been. He'd obviously been suffering, but we thought he'd bounced back. So shock and sadness, a little bit of trepidation at what's next, like everyone around the world, especially Catholics, but also, I'd say, an immense, even overwhelming sense of gratitude for this man's life of service to the church.
We've been speaking this evening about how he was a man of many firsts, one of which is in being a Jesuit. You are also a Jesuit priest, as we mentioned, with St Canis's parish in Sydney. How did that help define his papacy, and how did it help him do it differently to his predecessors?
It's interesting. I think when he was first made Pope, most Jesuits I spoke to were shocked. It had never happened before. The idea that you'd have a Jesuit as Pope was more or less unthinkable, I would say.
Why was that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think just historically, perhaps if you go back far enough, a few centuries, the Jesuits were seen to have a great deal of influence, perhaps an outsized influence for an order, a missionary order, and so to have a Pope who was also a Jesuit may have seemed to be too much concentration of power, perhaps. However, whatever the genesis of it, that was certainly almost a commonplace understanding that you couldn't have a Jesuit Pope. Then, of course, we had a Jesuit Pope. As a Jesuit, seeing him in his early days of his papacy, there was a wonderful sense of recognition of what you would hope a Jesuit would be. Direct, straightforward, focused on mission, particularly with what we call, and the whole church calls, an option for the poor, which he manifested in his day-to-day. He embodied it, really, as well as preached about it and spoke about it.
So what would go into that in a bit more detail for us? What were the practical examples of how he wrapped his arms around the poor?
Well, we saw it so often in his gestures, didn't we, as much as anything, but his constant preferencing of those who are on the edge, even literally the edge of the crowd, people with disability, trans people.
Edge of the world.
Edge of the world, appointing cardinals from places we all had to get out the map and see where they were from. And he did it with a sort of a joie de vivre, a peace, really. He took, obviously, Francis as his name, and originally some people thought, oh, that's Francis Xavier, the famous Jesuit missionary. It wasn't, of course, as we know, it was Francis of Assisi. And thinking of Pope Francis's life, I can't help but think of the line from Francis of Assisi, preach often and, if necessary, use words. This sense of a man who embodied a love for those who felt unloved or forgotten, especially by the church.
By preferencing the marginalised in oftentimes cases over the mainstream, was there any criticism of that?
Oh, I think, yes, absolutely. Anyone who was following Twitter and the kind of social media world particularly, or some outspoken North American critics who were very critical of Pope Francis, they were not the mainstream of the American episcopacy or even most Catholics. But without a doubt, sure, he was seen to be leftist or whatever they would brand him as. Of course, he transcended left and right. He wasn't interested in any of that. It was about closeness. He said himself, in a way, he was about the style of God, and he called it closeness, compassion and tenderness. And that transcends politics or culture wars. And his whole life, he transcended that sort of preoccupation that often those in the West have, particularly with politics, shall we say, and that lens on the church.
And so what do you think of the job he did? And I'm just interested to hear your perspective as a Jesuit. Is there a sense when someone from your order does get elevated to that kind of role, that is there a sense that our guy is there and he's going to do a good job?
I don't think it was quite like that for most Jesuits, although it's understandable to think of it that way. More of a sort of, yes, without a doubt, a heartwarming sense that this man we may understand each other, shall we say, and looking at him, the way he behaved in his papacy, there were some lovely moments of, as I said before, a recognition that this is the kind of Jesuit you would hope to be yourself, perhaps, or you'd like to see a Jesuit be in that simple, direct, straightforward, and simple style of life. That he really made a hallmark of his papacy, even moving out of the palace into something simpler at the little hotel there for guests. Being closer to people, I suppose, was something he wanted to achieve in his papacy, and he surely did.
What would some of the Catholics that you have gotten to know in your everyday life, what were some of the conversations that you might have had about him over the years and the work that he's done?
Look, that's been possibly one of the most fascinating things about Francis's papacy. The people who are very much on the edge or who are anti-church even, particularly, I'm an inner city parish priest, and we have a kitchen for people who are homeless, who are at risk of homelessness or housing vulnerability. They come in for a free meal. Many, many people felt his welcome, his global call of welcome affected them personally, individually. I think especially people who are on the fuzzy boundaries of not just the church but general accepted society felt that in Francis they had a friend.
Somewhere to belong.
Yeah, someone who preached to Jesus Christ, a message that felt true and resonated.
Would you regard his papacy as being one that marked by being socially progressive? What was he? To what extent was he? And to what extent did he address the big issue, one of the main issues confronting the church over the past 50, 60 years of sexual abuse?
Well, yeah, he struggled, I think, like every church leader to come to terms with those horrific, the reality of church abuse. But he certainly took it deeply seriously. That's very clear from the way he spoke and his actions, his moving on certain cases that perhaps hadn't been moved on. The reality, though, of Francis as well is that once again you can't put him in left or right boxes. He championed the environment. Laudato Si was one of his second encyclical that was incredibly influential around the world, championing the need to take seriously care for God's creation. Now, was that progressive? Was that, in a sense, it's profoundly traditional, going back to Francis of Assisi, this love of creation and to be grateful for what we've been given and to care for it, to steward creation. On other issues, he was, you would say, most definitely progressive, shall we say, around the need to have systems that care for those who are poor, disadvantaged or marginalised.
And on women?
Yeah, promoting women to leadership.
Well, look, exactly. Appointing the first woman to run a dicastery in Rome. There's no, it just hadn't been done before. Like having a Jesuit Pope. He was, as you said there, Joe, at the beginning, a Pope of many firsts, and that was a really powerful statement. And we'll see how that reverberates further on and gives strength to those others around the world, other church leaders who take courage from that kind of bold action.
It's interesting you touched on the environment. A couple of our guests this evening has made mention of that being one of his key legacies. Why do you think the environment was so important to him?
I think he saw in it just a core value of Christianity, to steward creation. But also he was a man of science. His original degree was in chemistry, I think. He wasn't oblivious to the mountain of data around climate change and the threat, especially though, particularly to the global south, for want of a better expression. This is, of course, his concern. Probably, though he never said it this way, but to displace the world's focus on the North American lens or the North American issues and to say, well, there's a whole world out there that sees things differently, for whom climate change is a pressing existential threat.
We had one guest on earlier tonight, and I think he said it was a bit strange that he'd appointed a cardinal from East Timor. What's your perspective on the way this Pope went about appointing cardinals?
Well, I'm like anyone else, sort of, in the bleachers watching this with my popcorn or whatever. It was stimulating and exciting that he would choose people from, shall we say, the edge of the world. But of course, where they are, they're not on the edge.
Yeah.
And to make that point that the consistory of cardinals, when they get together, should be a meeting of all these different perspectives. But once again, particularly from those nations who are often excluded in the news cycle.
Will that make the vote more complex, given that some of these cardinals are coming from of vaster reaches now?
Yeah, I'm not one of these professional Vatican watchers. You'll probably have one of them on at some point. I certainly think it makes it fascinating to think, what will this group of men from these literally the four corners of the world, from remote places, from poor countries, what will they do? How will the Holy Spirit move through them and with them? It is fascinating. We'll see what happens. Yeah.
And will you be there to see what happens? Is there a drive for you, being a Jesuit? Do you want to be over there now and be part of this extraordinary process that happens in Rome over the coming months?
Well, that would be great fun to watch. But no, I'm a foot soldier. You know, I've got my parish to look after. Yeah. But we'll all be praying for Pope Francis, of course, together and watching, like the rest of the world, for what happens next.
Have you had a chance to speak to any of your parishioners over the last few hours since the news broke of Pope Francis' passing?
It's really interesting. I was inundated with text messages and various other messages, different platforms from people. I would say especially young people. I used to work with university students. They're getting a bit older now, but now they don't necessarily come to Mass a lot. I would love them to come to Mass more often. But they were deeply moved, one after another, at Francis's passing. And I think that says something too about his reach to young people, particularly.
And no doubt you'll have more conversations and more interactions with your parishioners over the ensuing days.
Oh, absolutely. And I look forward to that, to be able to hear their impressions. But also, we come together to pray for him, on his journey to his eternal reward, and to pray for the Church, without a doubt. Yeah.
Okay, David Braithwaite, thanks so much for coming in and having a chat to us.
Thank you very much.
And do you want to get a plug in for St. Canice's while you're here?
Oh, well, thank you, Joe.
He knows to look down the barrel of the camera.
You've been there, yeah. Well, any billionaires out there who want to help us, we do feed about 150 people a day, and it costs a lot of money. So stcanice.org.au. Please,
Thank you, David.
If you want to donate. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
God bless. Thanks.
Well, the Archbishop of Sydney has paid tribute to Pope Francis as Catholics around Australia prepare to attend services tomorrow to offer their prayers. Senior reporter Fiona Whelan is at St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney. And Fee, what did the Archbishop have to say about the Pontiff?
Well, he described this as a day of grief and also gratitude. He said that Catholics were thankful to have had the Pope for so long, given he was 88 years old and he had been unwell for some time. Pope Francis never made it to Australia, but the Archbishop said that he met him a number of times, around a dozen times, and he shared one particularly personal tale of when he visited Rome a few years ago after the death of his mother.
3 years ago, when I went to Rome for a meeting when I had just buried my mother, and I was there the following week for a meeting, and when I went to shake his hand in the line of people meeting him, he immediately said to me, "My condolences on the death of your mum." And that he knew that she had died and that he cared was really quite remarkable.
And Fee, what services have been planned for tomorrow?
Well, Joe, we're told there will be many, many masses tomorrow and in the days ahead, starting with a 6:45am mass tomorrow here at St Mary's Cathedral, another one around lunchtime and one later in the day, as well as many prayers throughout the day. We have already seen a few people passing by tonight to pay their respects, and I spoke with one a little earlier.
I was a good man, a person of the people, and did many wonderful deeds.
Around 5 million Australians are Catholic, but the Archbishop noted tonight that many non-Catholics will no doubt also be joining in the prayers. He said that he had already received messages of condolence from Jewish leaders and Muslim leaders, and he said that's something very beautiful about Australia, that we all share in each other's joy and grief. Joe.
Okay, Fee Whelan reporting there from Sydney.
Well, let's bring in correspondent Michelle Rimmer from London again. And Michelle, over the past couple of hours since the news broke of Pope Francis's passing, we've seen crowds swarming to the square there.
Yes, so there have been reports that people have been crying in the streets in the Vatican outside St. Peter's Basilica. This was a much-loved leader of the Catholic Church. He was known as a man of the people, and to his last moment on Easter Sunday, he was out meeting and greeting with the public. And so this is a period of mourning in Rome. In Italy, we're hearing that all Italian football matches have been postponed out of respect. The country's now in 9 days of mourning, and so we're going to see many, many more people flock to St. Peter's Basilica and to a number of different basilicas around Rome where the pontiff visited and he favoured during his time as leader there. And so this is an outpouring of grief, not only in Rome but around the world. We're starting to hear messages from world leaders come in. We've heard from King Charles, who is one of the most recent public figures to actually meet with the pontiff. Just 2 weeks ago, he and his wife, Queen Camilla, visited Pope Francis while he was recuperating and attempting to recover from the illness that kept him in hospital for around a month earlier this year. In a statement, the King said that he has so much respect for the pontiff and that the world is in a state of shock. He said that he remembers their time together with particular affection, and he hailed the pontiff for touching the lives of so many. I've heard from the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. He said that Pope Francis's tireless efforts to promote a world that is fairer for all will leave a lasting legacy. And the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, said that a great man has left us. This is just a few of the world leaders that have reached out to express their appreciation for the work that Pope Francis did during his time leading the Catholic Church, and also to express their mourning and their condolences for Pope Francis's death.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as well, Michelle, saying he knew how to give hope, ease suffering through prayer, and foster unity. As you just mentioned, the next steps is that there's 9 days of mourning, and then, of course, becomes the process of the conclave after that.
Yeah, so during these 9 days of mourning, we have certain expectations. So Pope Francis has actually overhauled somewhat the process that had been a choreographed sort of routine that had been refined over centuries. Pope Francis, during his tenure, pushed this out of the way, and he said, look, he wants to have a much more pared back and a simpler funeral and burial process. So his coffin will be placed on display at St. Peter's Basilica. However, it won't be put on a stand as previous pontiffs have. So during that period of time, members of the public will be able to pass through and say their final farewells before he's buried at Santa Maria Maggiore Basilica, which is a basilica outside of the Vatican. It's one that was favoured by Pope Francis. He liked to visit there in his personal time. This is the first pontiff in 100 years that will be buried outside of the Vatican. His predecessors have been buried inside the grottos of the Vatican. So again, in line with Pope Francis and how he lived his life, he liked to be a simple man and he broke from tradition often. So he'll be doing that as he did in life. He will be in death. And then, as you mentioned, the cardinals that are eligible for election, those under 80, they'll be called to the Vatican where they'll meet in around 20 days' time. We're expecting to begin to elect a replacement for Pope Francis.
Michelle Rumer, we'll leave it there. Thank you.
The Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, the Catholic Church's most senior member in the Holy See, has announced a memorial mass will be held for Pope Francis at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on Wednesday at 10 a.m. local time. The church is one of the holiest sites in Christianity, believed to be the location where Jesus was crucified and buried.
Well, we've been speaking with Michelle Rimmer throughout the evening, but she also spoke with Vatican correspondent Christopher White about Pope Francis's legacy and what comes next for the Catholic Church.
Pope Francis was elected in 2013 on a reform mandate. The Catholic Church was in crisis from sex abuse, financial scandals, you name it. It was a messy situation. He came in as an outsider, and I think his legacy will be as a pope who really brought the church into the modern world, unafraid of dialogue, particularly when it comes on making the church more welcoming to LGBTQ people. That being said, he never changed church doctrine. He allowed priests to bless, gay couples, but he stopped short of changing any church doctrine. On women, many people would say, women have administrative jobs in the Vatican, but they still can't be ministers. So this is a conversation that he opened up, and he wasn't afraid of controversy, but he didn't overhaul the system either.
initially he was, Time Person of the Year and Gawk as the cool Pope, and this idea that he was this sort of Vatican rock star.
Yeah.
Did he live up to that hype?
I think Pope Francis, I've traveled around the world with him, and he's like a rock star. He electrified crowds. I've been with him in East Timor, where you have half the country at a mass on the seashore, and the mood is just pulsing with energy. I think any pope is going to have challenges. He's an 80-something-year-old man who, has to figure out how to connect with people. But I think, in many respects, he managed to find ways to connect and revitalize the faith for those that perhaps had walked away from the church.
Do you think that he brought the church with him in this sense? Like, is the Vatican and the cardinals, are they alongside him in these sort of pursuits, or is there being division?
I think it's fair to say that Pope Francis has had a polarizing papacy. There have been those that have been on board with his reform agenda, but then there are those that see him as opening up the church too much, putting the church on the cusp of overturning long-held, centuries-old tradition, and that makes some people very nervous. And for those people, they saw this Pope as a reformer that risked undoing the timeless treasures of the Catholic Church. But for others, they see him on the cusp of bringing the Church into a new age and finally sort of getting caught up with the world around it. So it depends on sort of where you're situated, how you will view this Pope's legacy.
You mentioned that you travelled around with him. Do you have any anecdotes or anything that you think is telling to who he was as a person?
Oh, I mean, the number of times I saw Pope Francis take his prepared remarks and just toss them in the bin are countless. I think back really, and I think it was 2023 when Pope Francis was in Portugal. And he really just tossed his prepared remarks out. And he got all the young people, about 1 million young people that were gathered there, to sort of repeat after him. He asked them, who is welcome in the Catholic Church? And he said, say in your own language, todos, 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 everyone, everyone, everyone. And I think that kind of crystallized his legacy. He was trying to make a church that was more hospitable and more welcoming. And he was at his best when he traveled often, because he was outside of the Vatican. He very often would say that the Vatican is like a prison. It constrains me. And when he's out of the Vatican, he's with the people. And I think that's the Pope that very much was in his element.
I mean, with each new Pope, there's this new opportunity for change, a new direction. Murmurings around, does it feel like the Church is looking for a new direction, or is this sort of more progressive take on some issues, something that's going to continue into the future?
I think, Pope Francis has named 2/3 of the men who will elect his successor. So it's very likely that the next Pope could be someone, almost certainly will be someone, that Pope Francis elevated as a cardinal. And in doing so, I think he's sort of left his stamp on the College of Cardinals, that sort of elite body of men in the Catholic Church that elect among themselves who the next Pope is. Now, I think there is an appetite for a Pope who is perhaps more disciplined than Pope Francis. This institution is so archaic and resistant to change that even those who generally share the Pope's pastoral priorities might say, we want someone that has the flavor of Francis, that has the same priorities, but someone who is more of an administrator, a better governor, someone who is less surprising. And I think that might be the sweet spot that they try to find when they're looking among themselves to say who comes next.
And that was Michelle Rimmer speaking with Vatican correspondent Christopher White about Pope Francis's legacy. Well, let's head to Asia now, where East Asia correspondent Kathleen Calderwood joins us from Taipei. And Kathleen, what has the reaction been, or do you expect the action will be, to the Pope's death throughout Asia?
Well, this is certainly going to be deeply felt across the region. Of course, the Pope came to visit Asia only in September, going to Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea and Singapore. And at that time, of course, that was a hugely significant trip, not only because of the Pope's frailty and the breadth of how many places he was visiting, but of course too because of the large Catholic populations, particularly in Timor-Leste and Papua New Guinea. But in Papua New Guinea, for example, the Pope recently cleared the path for the canonisation of Papua New Guinea's first saint, Saint Peter Torot. He was a local preacher who led a mission during the Second World War and was killed reportedly for practicing his faith. So that's a hugely significant development for Papua New Guinea. The Prime Minister there recently officially declaring that Papua New Guinea is a Christian nation. It's believed around a quarter of Papua New Guineans are Catholic. And there was some hopes that Pope Francis, after rallying after his poor health, that he would oversee that canonisation. So no doubt there will be some disappointment there in Papua New Guinea, but it will be deeply felt in the Philippines as well, a very, very strongly Catholic nation. About 80% of the population there, or 85 million people in the Philippines, are Catholic. In fact, the Pope visited the Philippines about a decade ago now, and that's being fondly remembered, that trip. Of course, the Pope very much known for his commitment to helping the poor, and in the Philippines he's being remembered for visiting the victims of Super Typhoon Yolanda. In particular, one of the reports that I've seen resurface was a story emphasising how when he was visiting those victims in Tacloban, it was raining extremely heavily, and that Pope Francis simply donned a regular yellow poncho over his papal clothes to deliver Mass there. That really being taken as a sign of how down to earth he was and how much he wished to connect with the local people there, who also, of course, would have been enduring that rain. The Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, has put out a very heartfelt post with several photos of him meeting Pope Francis, saying that he's deeply pained by the passing of His Holiness, that he'll always be remembered as a beacon of compassion, humility and spiritual courage. And the one other place where this will be potentially deeply felt, of course, is across China. The Pope in 2023 actually paid a visit to Mongolia, a country where most people are in fact Buddhist. There are only 1,500 Catholics in Mongolia, so this was very much seen as his attempt to reach out to Chinese Catholics. Now, Pope Francis actually brokered a controversial agreement with the communist authorities in China to share the responsibility for naming bishops. In fact, China being the only, or one of the only countries in the world where the Vatican doesn't hold sole responsibility for appointing bishops. And due to the split in terms of loyalty to Beijing or Rome, there is also an underground Catholic Church in China. So while officially it's believed there are at least 12 million Catholics in China, there could be many, many more because of the sort of grey area that the Catholic Church exists in China. So very much deeply felt around the region, from those countries that are very strongly Catholic right through to other countries where other religions dominate, but the Catholic faith held deeply by those who adhere to it.
Okay, Kathleen Calderwood there in Taipei. Many are remembering Pope Francis as a pope who had a focus on the poor and the vulnerable.
Earlier, we spoke with Archbishop of Melbourne, Peter Andrew Comensoli, who says Pope Francis was different from the beginning.
He came from Latin America, from the peripheries, is important to note, and the choice of the cardinals then to give to us someone who had come from the peripheries is really important. But he chose Francis of Assisi, that extraordinary saint who was a saint for the poor and for holding up the gift of the gospel to people, that he would then model his own time as Pope from that perspective is really important. And the last point I'd make is that a particular word of Pope Francis was very deeply important to him, and that's the word joy. Most of his statements began with the word joy, and we should not miss that.
Do you think he will also be remembered as someone, in terms of the structure of the church, someone who tried to elevate the laity in decision-making, and to what extent was he successful at that?
that was certainly a significant dimension of his time as Pope. But it should be remembered he's done that within the context of his own particular pastoral ministry as the leader of the Church. Each of the recent popes have brought a certain characteristic, if you like. I think of John Paul, the great leader of the Church through the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s. A great philosopher, Pope Benedict, one of those very unique theologians who will be significant for decades and even centuries, I think. Pope Francis, what an extraordinary pastoral Pope he has been.
And Archbishop, how have you been, given we're only 2 hours into this news, consoling those Catholics around you? What stories are those people sharing with you?
People are saddened. Some people quite strongly saddened by his death. I think also people recognise that this was, in some regards, coming, given his very serious health issues. And I think also people will be grieving for the gift that he has been for us for these last 12 years and looking now to offering their prayer for the cardinals as they now enter into this very significant moment for the cardinals of choosing a new pope.
You mentioned that you had a one-on-one meeting with him. Can you give us, obviously there was a private conversation, but in the context of this evening, what are your reflections on that one-on-one meeting?
So, yes, definitely. It was about a particular matter, and he listened. Firstly, he listened. How much is that a necessary thing for us all in our lives at this time, to listen? And then, having listened, he offered a few reflections as to what might be a way of approaching the matter that we discussed.
It's been wonderful of you to join us and share your thoughts and reflections, Archbishop of Melbourne, Peter Andrew Comensoli. Thank you. Well, Dr. Michel Chambon is a research fellow at the National University of Singapore. He's a French Catholic theologian and a cultural anthropologist interested in Christianity in Asia, and he joins us now from Singapore. Good evening to you, Michel.
Good evening.
How would you characterise Pope Francis's relationship, broadly speaking, with the Asian region?
Extremely engaged. Pope Benedict, before him, never came to Asia. During his papacy, Pope Francis came almost every year, visiting again and again all kinds of countries. Because of caring about the rise of Asia in the global world, because he cares for marginalized people, he had a very proactive engagement with Asian societies.
And what impact did that have on the popularity of Catholicism in Asia?
I think he brought an image, he reinforced an image of a Catholicism that is socially engaged, a religion that cares for the broader society, not for just its own survival. So not a minority religion, but a religion turned towards the whole society.
An interesting relationship was that of his with China. Most people that we've been speaking to this evening have been saying that he improved relationships with China. How do you see it? What is, the Chinese faith, Catholicism there?
So yes, he has improved a relationship with China. Catholicism has a very hard time through the Maoist period, and then after, during the 80s, 90s, during the opening up. The state was extremely suspicious against this religion led by a foreign power. But Francis, when he took office in 2013, really decided to reset the ways in which the Vatican engaged with China. And 5 years later, we saw an agreement. And China publicly recognized that a foreign sovereign, a foreign power, had a word to say in internal religious affairs. The Pope has a right to a veto power and a selection power for the selection of bishops. And that was a revolution in the Chinese communist history, this kind of recognition.
And there's a special relationship with East Timor?
Well, East Timor would not exist today without the strong support of the Catholic Church or without Timorese people engaging and mobilizing Catholic network. Many countries, including Australia, in the 80s, 90s, didn't see the point for independence of Timor-Leste. The Catholic Church supported that or was used by Timorese to make it happen. So without the Catholic Church, I don't think we will see today an independent Timor-Leste.
We know, Michelle, that the Pope also visited Myanmar, Japan, Mongolia, Singapore, Indonesia. How much of visiting those countries was about Catholicism and how much of it was just dealing with the challenges that are facing some of those nations?
It was always both at the same time. But we saw recently in Indonesia how the Pope was extremely warmly welcomed by the Muslim majority. The entire region and the world was surprised by the connection and the interest of the population into Pope Francis. So when Francis visited Asia, of course, he cared about Catholics, but he was not the chief of a tribe. He was never that. He was a universal sovereign, caring for all people. So in every single location, he will care for the complexity of the social map of these societies. And I think he has made a very deep positive influence in Asia, showing that he's not just visiting countries to greet powers, but he cares for the marginalized people, for people dealing with migration, poverty, exclusion, all kinds of people, not just Catholics, and also for all kinds of issues like global warming and ecological change.
Okay, Michelle Chambon, thanks so much for talking to us from Singapore.
Thank you.
Cardinals will now be summoned to Rome to choose Francis's successor. According to tradition, the Pope's death will be ritually confirmed by Vatican officials and 9 days of mourning will be declared.
The ABC's Jeremy Fernandez explains the centuries-old process that now has been set in motion.
The death of the Pope sets in motion a complex series of customs governed by ancient and elaborate rituals. Fine details from how the funeral is conducted to how his successor is chosen follow a strict set of rules and are executed by the highest order of the Catholic Church. Some traditions date back to the time of Jesus Christ, who is said to have selected the Apostle Peter, a lineage that's since been passed down through every pope. This period breaks down into 4 main parts: the death of the Pope, the funeral, the conclave, and the inauguration and installation. Pope Francis himself updated these rules in 2023, the changes reflecting his belief that the funeral of the Roman pontiff is that of a pastor and a disciple of Christ, rather than that of a worldly figure of power. It begins with the confirmation of his death, a task for the Cardinal Camerlengo, that's Italian for Chamberlain Cardinal, who oversees the transition process. In keeping with custom, the Camerlengo called out the Pope's baptismal name 3 times. With no response, he declared, "Vere Papa mortus est," the Pope is truly dead. The Camerlengo then sealed the apartments, a custom originally designed to prevent looting. He does so in the presence of his deputy. These seals won't be removed until a new pope is elected. This marks the beginning of what's known as sede vacante, the time when the papal office is vacant. The Camerlengo assumes control of the Vatican until a new leader is elected. Anything that requires papal assent during this period is submitted to the College of Cardinals for approval. The emblem, featuring the papal tiara over two keys crossed over each other, is temporarily modified, instead featuring an umbraculum, or umbrella, signalling a caretaker period. This time is also known as the interregnum. It's at this point that the Pope's death certificate is drawn up and the news is shared with church staff and then the world. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica toll, one ring for each year the Pope lived. In the presence of the Sacred College of Cardinals, the Camerlengo removes and destroys the Pope's ring that was presented to him at his inauguration. It's known as the Fisherman's Ring, and it bears the Pope's personal seal. This moment symbolises the end of his authority. After the Pope's death, 9 days of mourning are observed. These are referred to by their Latin name, Novemdiales. A prayer of petition called the Litany of Saints is chanted as the Pope's body is taken to St. Peter's Basilica. Mass is held daily to celebrate his life. Pope Francis opted for simpler rituals in this period, more in line with the structure of the basic Roman Missal, to highlight his role as pastor rather than pope. His body lies in an open coffin, not the customary catafalque, again a decision by Pope Francis himself to be commemorated with dignity, but like any other Christian. Over the Novemdiales, it's expected that more than 1 million mourners will arrive in Rome and visit the Vatican to pay their respects in funeral masses held in the square of St. Peter's. Within 4 to 6 days of his death, the Pope is buried in a coffin made of wood and zinc. This also marks Pope Francis's desire to depart from tradition, which would have historically seen the coffin being enclosed into larger ornate sarcophagi. Buried with him, a copy of the funeral program, along with bags of silver, gold and copper coins, the number of coins in each bag reflecting the number of years he served as Pope. Beneath St. Peter's Basilica is a labyrinth of underground tombs where more than 90 popes have been laid to rest, including the very first pope, Jesus' disciple Peter. Pope Francis, however, has elected the Basilica of St. Mary Maggiore in Rome as the location for his tomb, making him the first pope to be buried there since 1669. Throughout this period, cardinals draped in scarlet red vestments travel to the Vatican from around the world. Each appears wearing a ceremonial cassock or gown, mozzetta or shoulder cape, and biretta, a square hat. Together, these cardinals are the most senior Catholics in each of their countries. It's members of this group whose duty it'll be to vote for the next pope in a formal assembly known as the conclave. This process can begin no sooner than 15 days after the death of the pope. The Sacred College of Cardinals has 255 members, but not all of them are entitled to vote. There are rules guiding the electoral process. No more than 120 cardinals are entitled to cast a vote for the new pope. This group is chosen by seniority and age. Those over the age of 80 become ineligible to participate. The voting rules also stipulate that cardinals should come from all parts of the world and from very different cultures. And most importantly, a 2/3 majority is needed for a pope to be elected. Historically, the selection of a new pope can take anywhere from days to years. The longest, more than 7 centuries ago, took nearly 3 years, from 1268 to 1271, resulting in the election of Pope Gregory X. It was he who put into law the Ubi Periculum, a charter or set of rules for electing a pope. His most important change was to ban cardinal electors from contact with the outside world until a new pope is chosen. And to this day, radios and TVs are removed, no newspapers or magazines are allowed in, and all phones are banned during the election process. Before the conclave begins, a stove and chimney are set up inside the Sistine Chapel. The chapel is swept for covert listening and recording devices. Jamming mechanisms are installed to block electronic communications. Throughout the vote, cardinals stay in the Domus Sanctae Martyr, the same building that housed Pope Francis. The cardinals eat, sleep and vote in the sealed areas of the building until a new leader is chosen. The cardinals are escorted through the Pauline Chapel and then to the Sistine Chapel. The conclave was first held here in 1492, and it's been the permanent location of the conclave since 1878, symbolically beneath Michelangelo's fresco of the Last Judgment. The cardinals swear an oath of secrecy, vowing not to share any details of the vote both during and after the conclave. Accompanying the cardinal electors entering the conclave are a select group of senior Vatican officials, along with 2 doctors and 2 technical experts. The voting then begins. Each elector is handed a rectangular ballot sheet, printed with a Latin phrase translating to, "I choose as Supreme Pontifex," and a space to name their nominee. Each vote is secret. Technically, any baptised male can be elected pope, but the last time cardinals reached outside their ranks was in 1378, when they chose Pope Urban VI. The folded ballot paper is placed on a gilded plate and then slid into an urn. On the first day of the conclave, 1 round of voting is held in the afternoon. On each subsequent day, 4 votes will take place, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. Immediately after each count, the ballots and all related notes are burned. To the world outside, watching keenly, a declaration of the outcome is signalled with a puff of smoke from the flames of the burning ballot papers. The smoke is funnelled up the chimney and out of the roof, giving the crowds assembled in St. Peter's Square a signal of how the voting has gone. If no one has been elected, the smoke appears black. If a new pope has been chosen, the smoke is white. In years past, wet and dry straw were mixed with the ballot papers to produce the black or white smoke. These days, a chemical dye is added to remove any ambiguity about the colour of the smoke. Once a pope has been chosen, the Dean of the Cardinals will formally ask him to accept his election. He will also ask the incoming pope what name he wishes to assume. Traditionally, he would pick a name of a previous pope or a pope he wishes to emulate. The new pope is then taken into a side room to change out of the red vestments of his cardinalship and into the white vestments of the papacy. Within the hour, heavy red drapes over the windows are drawn aside and the balcony doors swing open. The senior cardinal deacon emerges onto the central balcony of St. Peter's to declare, "Habemus Papam," we have a pope. The new pope, wearing pontifical white, then appears on the same balcony. He gives his first blessing as Supreme Pontiff, ending with the words, "Ubi et Orbi," to the city and the world. This declaration concludes the papal conclave, which the Pope usually disbands after addressing the body of cardinals. The final series of events, the installation and inauguration of the new Pope, usually takes place a few days later on a date chosen by the new pontiff. The inauguration is celebrated with Mass at St. Peter's Square. The cardinals bestow the new pope with a pallium, a long woven wool vestment worn around the neck, symbolic of the pope's role as shepherd of his church. He's also presented with a newly cast Ring of the Fisherman, featuring a signet of Peter, a reference to Jesus' charge that his disciple should be a fisher of men. This is the ring customarily kissed by papal guests in devotion to the Church and his authority. The traditions and belief by which one pope is farewelled and another is installed span more than 2,000 years, a rare and captivating cultural practice that binds the world's 1.3 billion Catholics. In him, they have a new authority of the doctrine, a spiritual guide, and a unifier of the faith.
And I'll just take this opportunity to welcome viewers on the ABC main channel to our ongoing coverage of reaction to the death of Pope Francis. In his final address before his death, Pope Francis called for a ceasefire in Gaza. He made regular calls to the parish priest representing Palestinians in Gaza during the conflict.
Farouk Gibran is spokesperson for the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem, which Gaza is a parish of, and he joins us now from Jerusalem. Good evening.
Good evening. Hello.
Thank you for joining us, Farouk. We appreciate your time. Can you tell us, what did the Pope Francis, mean to those Catholics that you work with and speak to every day in Gaza?
Pope Francis was, first of all, a friend. Beyond the shepherd of the church, he was a friend of the parish of Gaza, a friend who used to have daily calls with the parish to ask them, simple questions like a father asks, very simple. What did you eat today? What did you have for lunch? What did you have for dinner? What did you do today in the parish? So he was a friend, he was a shepherd, and a person whose loss will be felt very, very strongly.
What did his contact with and advocacy for the people there mean?
Could you repeat the question? I couldn't hear you, sorry.
How much did he mean to you and the people there in Gaza?
He meant very much. He's, as I said, he was a very good friend, and his support and his encouragement were very, very, very meaningful to the people in these times that they are passing through.
And Farid, what has the reaction been over the last few hours?
First of all, it's a surprise because yesterday he was able to congratulate and to wish happy Easter to the people in Rome and to the entire church. Surprise, sadness, and also gratitude for years of exemplary and eloquent service to the church and to the Christian people.
And how deep and extensive is the faith of the people in Gaza, the Catholic population there?
The Catholic population in Gaza is very small. They are now all located in the parish compound, in the Patriarchate compound in Gaza, hiding there from the atrocities of the war, and trying to cope with the situation, hoping for the end of this war.
And what does their faith mean to them through this?
Okay, I can hear you very low. Your voice is very...
How important is their faith to them through the challenges that they face?
The faith?
Faith, yes. You might be able to hear me a little better.
Faith is what is keeping them moving. Faith in better days. Faith in that people are praying and wishing them well. Faith that this obscure cloud of war, of atrocities, of sadness, of killings, of no hope will pass, and the better days will come. We all pray for that.
Farid, you mentioned before that Pope Francis would ring your parish. I believe he spoke to the priest from your parish, Father Gabriel Romanelli, on numerous occasions. Did Father Romanelli ever share any of those conversations with you or share his relationship with the Pope?
As I said, yes. As I said, the Pope used to call the parish every evening to wrap up the day, to see how their day was passed. He spoke to the parish priest to encourage him, because they are all They are both shepherds. Father Gabriel is the shepherd of the Catholic parish in Gaza, and Pope Francis is the shepherd of the entire Catholic Church. So he spoke to him, he encouraged him in his mission. He encouraged the other priest, Father Youssef, who was there. He asked them how things are going, what their needs are, and asked them even that time to pray for him. And he prayed, of course, for them.
Farid Gibran, spokesperson for the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem, of which Gaza is a parish. Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's recap our breaking news this evening. Pope Francis, history's first Latin American pontiff, has died. He was 88. The Vatican announced the news in a video statement saying his entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and of his church. Crowds of people have been gathering in St. Peter's Square in Vatican City to pay their respects, and world leaders have been releasing statements paying respects to the pontiff.
Cardinals will now be summoned to Rome to choose Francis's successor. According to the tradition, the Pope's death will be ritually confirmed by Vatican officials and 9 days of mourning will be declared. We have heard many world leaders coming out expressing their thoughts on the passing. Some of those, Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister, spoke earlier tonight saying Pope Francis's compassion embraced all humanity, and today he will be mourned by Catholics and non-Catholics alike. We also heard from the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, who went on to say, above all else, he, Pope Francis, was driven by Christ's values and mercy and forgiveness.
And the people that we've been speaking to through this evening have spoken of two main factors in terms of Pope Francis's legacy. One, internally within the Catholic Church, was an effort to elevate the power or the contribution of the laity to discussing the policies of the Church. And there's a question mark over how much that will continue under the new Pope, whoever that may be. And the other legacy, and a more public and broad legacy, is his compassion. And we spoke to a Jesuit priest earlier on, and Pope Francis was a Jesuit, the first time a Jesuit has become Pope. And David Braithwaite was speaking of that compassion as a key part of the legacy of Pope Francis and reconnecting with people around the world through that compassion. Thanks for joining our continuing coverage this evening of the death of Pope Francis. I'm Joe O'Brien.
And I'm Catherine Robinson. News Breakfast will be on early at 5 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, but stay with us now as our coverage continues. Yvonne Young will take you through the rest of the evening as the world reacts to this historic news.
And a very good evening.